In the summer of 2009 or 2010, I would go with my family to the free school lunches hosted by the public schools in my area. During that time, I became friends with a boy around my age. I think he was about 11 at the time. Our families knew each other well, so we always met up and hung out at these events quite often. We'll call the boy Ray. Ray had a history of causing problems. Before we'd officially met, about a year or so before, Ray had staged a home invasion and made it appear as if he had been kidnapped. It resided in a county-wide hunt, which my parents were also a part of. He was eventually spotted by a stranger, who just so happened to have seen the news on him, and she called the police right away. In the end, he admitted to having staged it all, but was never made to apologize or face any consequence. He had become bitter over the adoption of 2 new brothers, and had made it well known. I could never really figure out why, though. Anyway, the summer after the manhunt fiasco, I, with my incredibly naive mind, I thought that everyone was judging him a bit too harshly. I became his friend, and at these free lunches we would always hang out. A couple of years go by with us being friends, and I've just entered my teens. It was the day before my birthday. Ray had been left alone with the 2 brothers, and I guess he saw his chance. Some details are unclear, but it's speculated he went after the older one, the 10 years old, first. He grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed him repeatedly. Not just stabbed, he almost filleted him open. Then he went to the younger one, then 4 years old, and did the same to him. Ray fled from the house, and the family came home to see that awful scene. The police caught up to him that night, and he showed no remorse. I, of course, was heartbroken at the thought my friend would do something so terrible. It was like something out of a movie, not real life. A couple of years go by, and now Ray is in prison. He attacked another inmate, fully intending to kill him. This, of course, hit the news. I was about 15 then. Another heartbreak for me. He is a literal sociopath, and it took quite a while for that to sink in for me. I struggled with this betrayal of someone who I considered to be a close friend. But now, as an adult, I don't have much sympathy for him. We'll never cross paths again, and that's just fine with me. This happened in August of 2013. I was visiting Montreal for their Diversite weekend, which was basically like Pride but took place the long weekend before the official Montreal Pride. My best friend at the time had met a guy at Toronto Pride a month earlier, and he invited both of us to come there so my friend wouldn't be uncomfortable going to spend the weekend with someone he didn't know. We arrived on Thursday, and the trip was going pretty great. We went out the first night, walked the streets that were closed off to cars the next day, and our host made us a nice dinner. We went out again on Friday night. Just a quick note before I get into what happened. I partied quite a bit with drugs at this time, and I also in the past had a tendency to lose my cell phone. So for about a year prior, I stopped taking my cell phone with me whenever I went out. So that Friday night we went out to a club. Parking, which has sadly since closed. It was another pretty fun night. The music was great, and the tequila shots were incredibly cheap. I was dancing and moving all around the club, but would circle back and check in with my friend and our host. I would also run into people that I knew who were also visiting from Toronto, and ended up taking some MDMA from one of them. Danced some more until I was completely soaked in sweat, so I went to the bathroom to wipe myself down and pee. When I got to the bathroom, there was somebody leaving, but it looked like I was the only one in there. I went and used the stall because I have a hard time using the urinal, and once I came out, I was quite surprised to see a man in the corner of the washroom, standing and smiling at me. He looked to be in his mid-30s, on the shorter side and a bit chubby. He was wearing a polo t-shirt and jeans, and had glasses as well. I remember thinking when I saw him that he reminded me of some sort of accountant. I'm not sure why that thought popped into my head. I was pretty sure I'd never heard the door open, but I couldn't be 100%. So I smiled back and said hello as I went to wash my hands. "Hello," he responded. "Are you having fun tonight?" I replied that I was and that the music was incredible and was wiping myself down with paper towels. "Do you want to do some coke with me?" he asked. No, this was not the first time I'd been offered coke in a bathroom at a nightclub, and had done this in the past as well. I ended up having some good experiences and met some interesting people. I was already high and drunk anyway, so I didn't think too much of it. "Sure, I would love to. Thanks. I just live right near here. It's at my place if you don't mind coming over. We can do some lines and have a drink, then walk back to the club." Obviously, looking back, I realize how extremely dumb my following actions were, and I can't imagine myself being so stupid and careless now. But without thinking, I agreed to it and left with him. The club allowed you to re-enter if you had a wristband. We chatted a bunch on the walk over to his place. He asked me where I was from because I didn't seem like I was from Montreal, what parties I had gone to, how old I was, and my name. I asked his name as well, but he instead responded that we had arrived. The whole walk felt like just 5 minutes, but honestly I hadn't been paying much attention to where we were going actually. His apartment was in this building that had 3 floors, and his unit was on the second. You had to climb this long, narrow metal staircase, and his door seemed to be in the middle of 2 other apartments on either side. He unlocked the door and let me in first, flicked on the lights, and told me to make myself comfortable. I was walking and noticed he had carpet, so I turned around to ask him if I should take my shoes off, when I noticed he was locking the door from the inside with a key above the regular lock. In that moment, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of dread I had never felt before. The danger I had possibly put myself in another city, no phone, nobody knows where I am, and now seeing this person locking their door from the inside with a key. I thought to myself, I'll pretend I didn't see that. I won't take off my shoes. I'll politely hang out for a few minutes and then ask to head back. I also thought I could be having an extreme overreaction to what I saw, because I was high as fuck. But as I looked around, everything inside me was screaming that I needed to get out of here. I went and sat on the arm of the couch. He said I should take my shoes off and relax. I was getting a better look at him now in the lights of his apartment. He looked plain and unassuming, but his eyes looked shifty, and he pulled down both of the shades on the windows that were on each side of the door. I told him that I was okay. I was eager to get back to dancing, so he said he would make us drinks and then we could go back. The apartment looked much bigger inside than it did from the street. It was an open layout with the living room beside the kitchen, and then a hallway in the middle with closed doors painted black. I could hear music coming from one of them. I asked him if someone else was there, as he came from the kitchen with a glass. He replied that there wasn't. As he handed me my glass, he looked me up and down. I wasn't wearing a shirt at the time. He said with this increasingly creepy smile spreading across his face, "You have a very beautiful body, especially your chest. Would you mind if I took some photos before we went back?" Every alarm bell is going off in my head now, and all I can think about is Jeffrey Dahmer and all his Polaroids, and what I'm going to do. It was such a creepy thing to say. All I could manage was a polite laugh as I take in a drink and say, "Sure." "Excellent," he says. He then tells me to take off my shoes. He's going to get the coke and his camera to finish my drink. He walked down the hall, takes out his keys and unlocks the second door. He opens it just enough to slip in, and closes it behind him. The second that door was closed, I jumped up, ran over to the sink, and dumped my drink. I put my shirt on and ran to the front door. I was able to turn and unlock the regular lock, but the door would still not budge. I kept turning and pulling and twisting, but nothing would happen. Then I heard from behind me, "What are you doing?" I turned around. He was standing at the base of the hallway with one of those professional cameras slung around his neck, holding a square mirror with a pile of white powder on it. I thanked him for the drink, gesturing to my empty glass, but it was getting late, and I wanted to get back. We could exchange numbers and maybe meet up tomorrow if he wanted. His demeanor changed. He was still smiling, but his tone when he next spoke sounded extremely irritated. He asked me if I was nervous about taking the photos. I should just wait for my drink to relax me. I said no, I wanted to go right now. This exchange of him telling me to stay and me saying no went back and forth for about a minute when he suddenly glared at me, put down the mirror, pointed at the couch and said, "Sit down now." Not knowing what to do or how I was going to get out of this, I remembered that there were other units on each side of us, and it had to be around 2:30 in the morning at this point, so I started screaming at the top of my lungs like a madman, banging on the doors and windows, the walls even. "Shut up! Be quiet!" He snapped at me as he ran to the door. He quickly unlocked it and shoved me out, then stepped aside. I bolted out that door and down the stairs, skipping the bottom steps. I hopped over the side of the railing. I looked up behind me when I landed. He wasn't there, but I heard a door slam and took off running down the street. I hadn't paid attention to the walk there, so I didn't know which way to walk, but I knew it was relatively close by, and luckily I was able to wave down a passing taxi and take it back to the bar. When I got back, I found my friend in the same spot dancing. The whole incident must have been less than half an hour. I was too embarrassed about how stupid I had been, and being back in the club, I started to feel bad that I had just freaked out on this nice man. I didn't say anything, but I stayed by his side until we left shortly after I got back. The entire thing felt quite surreal, and I remember the next day when I did tell my friend, kind of laughing it off and joking about getting murdered, trying to make light of it because it was so damn scary. It wasn't until years later after joining Reddit and this sub, reading other stories, that I started to think about that night more and more, and realized just how much potential danger I'd put myself in. I'm a 28-year-old female living in Edmonton, Alberta. I'm an indigenous mix and stand at 5'4". A lot of personal reasons have led up to me being in the position I was for several years. And to sum it up, I come from nothing and have no family support. This means from age 19 to 28, I ended up working as an escort through agencies in order to have income. It was always on and off, and honestly quite embarrassing. The trauma still lingers in my mind. To this day, I cannot relax fully and always monitor my surroundings, even if it's from my peripheral vision. I have many stories related to working in the industry, as us girls call it. I may submit more stories in the future, as I do have a lot of odd and scary encounters. I want to start by saying I'm very introverted. I mind my business and don't do drugs or party. I like to be in and out and leave with some sanity and dignity. My story happened in 2018 when I worked at a studio in Edmonton. I started working mainly nights, which meant I was in studio from 4 p.m. to 11 p.m. We're legally licensed working girls for safety and legal aspects. We accept all types of people, sex, and races. This means I work with both females and males. This studio had approximately a dozen females and one transgender woman that I've previously worked with and met in a different studio. I'll call her Kat. I'm not judgmental, and I don't hate anyone based on their identity or how they choose to live. I do judge based on how someone treats me, though. Kat was currently the receptionist/housekeeper/working girl at this studio. Kat was previously in the military, prior to transitioning. Guys did not step out of line, knowing Kat was down the hall. This was a bonus for us girls. We felt somewhat safer. I had worked at this studio for about a month before things started to get a bit odd. I started to notice that Kat's demeanor was slowly changing towards me, from friendly to an ominous energy. I would catch her watching me intently, and even copying me when I would do my makeup like she was competing with me. Weird, but I shook it off every time something happened. Work started to get busier with clients, and Kat had been offering to greet and put my clients in rooms before I started my sessions. She even offered to clean up my room when I was done, which meant I paid her at the end of the day for this assistance. I greatly appreciated the help, especially on busy days. Kat would snicker and laugh under her breath when she would clean my room. A bit odd, but I brushed it off. As time went on, though, Kat would make comments, and one particular one caught my attention. I won't repeat what she said, but it was something that occurred while behind closed doors during a one-on-one appointment with a client. That was the moment I realized something was wrong. There was absolutely no way she could have known that this had occurred, so red flags immediately started going off. I didn't say anything and walked away, trying to decipher what I just heard. I went to our staff lounge and told the owner what had just happened, and she seemed horrified as well. As soon as Kat went out for a smoke, the owner immediately told me to go check the room for any hidden cameras. I didn't find anything at first, but my gut instinct was telling me otherwise. Over a period of time, the owner and I came to a conclusion that Kat was possibly putting and removing the cameras when setting up and cleaning my room, as per appointment. This made sense since we couldn't ever find them anywhere. Random comments had not stopped, and the ominous demeanor continued. I mentioned this to some of my coworkers, and they had told me some stories and drama that Kat had been linked to, so everything began to verify that I wasn't paranoid or crazy. Other girls didn't trust Kat and refused assistance from her, so I began to refuse as well. Everyone had their own negative story now of experiences with her. Eventually, I got so fed up of the drama and unprofessionalism, since the owner refused to fire or address the incidents, I started showing up less and bailing on shifts. After a few months, I ended up leaving the studio. Kat eventually stopped working there, and I've not seen her since, thank God. From what I was told, she stopped working, and no studio will hire her now. I think it has something to do with lots of similar incidents. I never reported this to Vice, but I wish I had. Vice is a unit that works with the government and police, and monitors the studios to make sure girls have their alias IDs and aren't being trafficked or forced to work against their will. To this day, I regret not reporting Kat or the owner. My privacy was violated, and I have to live with the humiliation of these experiences. Being an escort is not all glam and luxury. There are far darker aspects to this lifestyle. I don't recommend it, and if anyone has been in this position, please be aware of your surroundings and tell someone if something feels wrong. I'm 33 years old, and this took place when I was around 4 or 5. I want to start by saying that up until about 3 years ago, I had always thought that this was just a dream, though I now believe that this is a memory, and I'll tell you why at the end. I grew up in a little community called Burton, British Columbia, which is not even large enough to be called a town or village. It's right outside of Naksuk, BC, in the Kootenays of British Columbia. I think this is important because this area is both very, very rural and known to have a high amount of strange sightings. So, as I said, I was about 4 or 5 years old, and this memory is oddly vivid compared to others from that age. We lived in a trailer, though not in a trailer park. Neighbors were few and far between. Anyways, my bedroom was the last door on the right, and my mom's bedroom was at the very end of the hall. I was lying in my homemade loft waterbed, and was on my right side facing my open bedroom door. My mom and her boyfriend were in their bed, talking quietly, and I could see the light from her bedside lamp reflecting off the hallway wall outside my door. This is going to sound strange to say the least, but all of a sudden, a very tall dog man steps into my doorway and just stands there for a minute, watching me. I remember being instantly terrified and completely frozen in fear, probably shock as well. He starts walking towards me. I try to scream, but it gets stuck in my throat, and all I can get out is a tiny squeak. So this man walks up to stand beside my bed, and because I'm in a loft bed, he doesn't have to bend down or anything, but he reaches out and picks up my arm and puts it in his mouth. And that's it. I don't remember being bit. I don't remember him or it leaving. I don't even remember talking to my mom about it, but somehow I've never forgotten this. Now, about 3 years ago, I was online and happened across the accounts of Marco Polo on the island of Enga Monane. He spoke of encountering these dog-headed barbarians, which were a race of men with heads of mastiff dogs or something. While reading about this, I came across a painting and several sketches of this cynocephalus, as they're called. As soon as I saw the painting, it was like something in my brain just clicked. I instantly thought of my dream, and somehow I knew it wasn't a dream at all. It was a memory. I can't explain it, and in the last 3 years I've wondered endlessly what happened after I lost my memory of that night, what it means and why it happened. I know this sounds crazy, but I believe this 100% happened to me. Could it have been a dream? Sure, maybe. Sleep paralysis? I don't know. But if I were going to concoct some dog-headed monster up in my 5-year-old imagination, I think it would have been a werewolf, as they were all I were familiar with at that age, and until recently. I recommend looking up the Andaman Islands and cynocephaly or Marco Polo's dog-headed race, and you'll come across more than a few stories of people encountering this all through history. Has anyone else ever heard of something that sounds like this? What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here as always. I got an unfortunate announcement for you guys tonight. You might have noticed that a lot of my videos have been deleted or put onto the unlisted category. That's because I just recently got 2 copyright strikes all at once. So if I get one more, my channel will be deleted. So I can't really do much about that except for remove everything, I guess. Just hope that somebody just doesn't decide to strike me and delete my entire channel. So from now on, I might be posting a little less often, or at least not posting Reddit stories or the Let's Not Meet as often. If I can get permission for the stories and make sure they're not gonna go crazy on me, then yeah, sure, I'll do some videos. But other than that, I don't really want to risk it right now. I can't until April or all my stuff will get deleted. If you guys want to help me out for a couple of months and send in your stories, it doesn't really matter how long they are, as long as they're, grammatically correct and everything and are easy to read. I'll go ahead and read those, and we'll try to make it by on that if you guys are up for it. If you guys decide to send in a story for me, please be sure to include in the tagline how you would like the story to be named, how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in, and the category of the story if it has one. Links to all my social media will be in the description below, including my Facebook, Twitter, and Gmail accounts. I also have a link to my second channel, which I will put in there that I just made, just in case this one gets destroyed. You guys can go subscribe there, and we'll do some stuff like web novel readings and maybe continue the scary story stuff if this one does get deleted. Other than that, please be sure to let me know in the comments what you guys think. Please be sure to leave any feedback, like, share, subscribe if you feel so inclined. Those really help me out. They promote me on the YouTube algorithm, especially since I've had to delete so many videos. Please be sure you click that bell as well, because I could really use all the support I can get right now. If you guys are curious about the music or the art used in the video, that's listed in the description as always. And I hope you guys have a good day. That's all for now, I think.
This happened 2 days ago, in southwest Sweden. It was around 5 p.m. in the afternoon, and I decided to meet up with one of my friends. We both have mopeds, scooters, and drove to the grocery store to get a snack for our small trip. After that, we headed towards a beautiful sheep pasture that I had been to once and wanted to visit again. It was maybe 15 minutes away from the center of our town. After a while, I came to a narrow road surrounded by a forest. Since it rarely drives any kind of vehicle out there, I started to drive on the middle of the road, and sometimes even the part of the road meant for the approaching cars. At one moment I looked in my rearview mirror and saw my friend driving close to the edge of the road. At first I thought she was trying to make a point that I should keep to my part of the road, but then she drove even closer to the edge and almost fell into a ditch. I stopped and waited until she caught up with me. We were both laughing and I asked her what happened. She said she was distracted by something weird on a tree besides the road and forgot to turn. We laughed and kept on going. Later on, we sat in the sheep pasture eating our snacks. We started talking about it again for some reason, and I asked her what she saw. And what she described was some kind of wood plank nailed to a tree, and that it looked like a figure, a person with just holes as eyes. My reaction was, "What the hell, that's disturbing." And she responded with, "Yeah, kinda creepy." We decided to try and locate it again on our way home. We stopped by the road and I turned off the engine. When I looked up, I spotted it right away and it gave me the creeps. It was hanging there in a tree, looking all dead, and I decided to take a picture of it when we drove home. When I saw it, my thoughts went straight to cults and murderers that put up some kind of sign to show where they've been, or a hint that they're about to make a move. I don't think I'll go there again, and I'm not sure what it could be, but it just didn't feel right. I live in a 16-foot camper. Before the rest of my family moved here, this was my research vehicle. I researched the history of human habitation in Colorado, so this camper has been everywhere. I've been to the harsh southeastern canyonlands, stepped out the door in the morning to find a herd of wild horses in the northwest, and endured severe storms on the short grass prairie. For a while, I took it to the US-Mexico border and lived on the grounds of a museum and battle site in the Chihuahua Desert. I'd been there for quite a bit, and at 2 a.m. I heard and felt an impact on my roof, just over my bed, and claws, big claws. I've seen Jeepers Creepers. I know how this works. Anyway, I just laid there, terrified, listening to something very big attempt to peel my camper like a tin can. About an hour later, it went away. In the morning I did snake patrol. Just before winter, a lot of rattlesnakes, lizards and such try to move into the museum, and when I looked at my camper, I saw blood on the roof and scratches. The small critters of the desert took care of a lot of whatever it was, so I didn't have much to wash off by the time I finished snake patrol. One thing I love and miss about the Chihuahua is its simplicity and efficiency. Everything has a role. Humans are just animals with fancy dens. Even if I am to be eaten by a chupacabra, it doesn't seem bizarre, because I'm living in a place where the bizarre is normal. So I went to bed that night, and the next, without much worrying about my imminent demise. A couple of nights later, it happened again. 2 a.m. Thunk, claws, scrabbling. Jesus. This thing spans the entire width of my camper. Claws scrabbling. Me, terrified. The thing goes away an hour later, and there's blood on my camper roof. The next night, thunk, claws, my camper roof being pummeled. Weird sounds. And then, thunk, on the other end of my roof. and the sound of claws coming closer to the roof over my bed. I ran out of the door, frantically unlocking my truck. From the safety of my truck, I looked back at my camper. The male owl looked on from my roof as a female owl devoured his furry, very dead offering. He lived in the water tower. She lived across the border near a feedlot. My camper roof was the only patch of white within plain view of her community. He'd been demonstrating his abilities to hunt and kill for a week, bringing half-dead prey to the roof, letting it escape over and over, and pinning it down over and over. Finally, on this night, he wooed her. It was so sweet, I never minded cleaning up the blood after that. It only lasted another week, and then I saw them together at the water tower. This happened while I was in Boy Scouts in Utah. The first thing happened when I was 8 to 10 years old. We were backpacking in one of the surrounding mountains of Salt Lake Valley. I can't remember which one. We'd finally reached our campsite after a few hours of hiking with heavy backpacks around dusk. Lit our camp stoves, ate dinner, and then set up tents for bed. Since it was a clear, cloudless summer night, my friend and I decided to leave the rain fly off and stargaze before sleeping. Our campsite was an open area, so we had a hell of a view of the Milky Way and thousands of stars. It was beautiful. The tent was kind of cramped. It was a 2-person tent, but really only one person could comfortably sleep in it. But we didn't care. It was one night. About an hour or two after, we started chatting and stargazing. We even saw the ISS pass slowly over us. One star was flashing different colors. We thought nothing of it at first, since planets tend to do that, but then it started zipping around randomly, from one end of the sky to the other, without pattern, all the while still flashing different colors. At first I thought I was seeing things, but my friend was seeing it too. It kind of freaked us out, but we just watched it. It kept zipping around the sky at insane speeds, occasionally stopping for a few seconds, then continued zipping around. At first we thought maybe someone else was pulling a prank, but everyone else was asleep. We heard no laughter and no laser pointer could change color like that, so we kept watching it, never actually feeling afraid. And then, after what seemed like hours, it was just gone. We lay there for about an hour watching to see if it would return. It never did. The next morning we packed up, hiked back to our cars and left. Not sure if this next part is related, as we could have just been dehydrated. But it was pretty silent the whole ride home, and when we stopped for lunch on the way, someone said they didn't feel good, like throw up bad. At the time I thought nothing of it, other than, stay away from me, I don't want to be sick too. He was fine the following Monday at the meeting, so obviously nothing too bad. But now, all these years later, I have to wonder, whatever that star/planet or even UFO was, did it make him sick? Or was it just dehydration? This is another thing that happened to me. It was during my very last campout when I was about to turn 18. It was at City of Rocks on the Idaho side. On the way there, we stopped at the skeleton of a house to wait for the rest of the cars. It was bare framework, half collapsed, and absolutely littered with debris. Even a large dugout rectangular hole, probably for the basement. Being the stupid teenagers we were, we decided to explore a little. The leaders telling us to be careful and to watch out for nails and potentially snakes. No one was hurt, even the couple of boys who decided to jump down into the basement area. Nothing of interest was found, so we got back into the cars and drove the rest of the way. Not sure if it's related, but something I've decided to add since it was at least interesting. The rest of the weekend went as usual. Even the one kid who always gets hurt manages to have to be taken to the hospital. We're forbidden to climb the rocks after that. So to protest, we broke the no electronics rule. The leaders didn't get upset at this and agreed that it was fair. Another friend and I, the one I'm very close with, had a Slenderman game on his tablet, which was still popular at the time. This is kind of important later. It was after midnight, we're all in our tents, and our electronics have exhausted their batteries. We lay down looking out the window at the very small mountain we all climbed all weekend. It's big enough to take a good 10 minutes to free climb, but small enough to see from the very top of our window about 20 yards away from base. So, more of a huge mountain-shaped rock. Anyway, it was about that time when we saw several shadowy figures that looked to be crouching low on the top of the mountain. Each time we tried to focus on one, it would vanish. This freaked us out a little. There were 3 of us in the tent, and we all saw them. We chalked it up to our mind playing tricks on us since we were exhausted, and we've been taking turns trying to beat the Slenderman game. But we said it was best to ignore them and go to sleep. We were probably just out of our minds, trying to make us think there was something there, but who knows. I've seen some scary stuff in my life, and even my father has some scary stories from his childhood growing up in the southern Idaho desert. I guess I'll never know for sure. 2 weeks ago, I went camping in the Zagros Mountains as part of a last-minute post-college unwinding session. I was getting ready to start working at a local law firm, but I wanted to see a little more of the world before too much time passed. On an impulse, I bought myself a ticket, and 3 days later, I was flying out of the Boston International Airport. 29 hours later, I was standing at one of the trailheads, which started in the southwestern corner of the Iranian Plateau and ran for 14 miles until it merged with another trail. While I don't have any idea about the local geography, I did have some pretty good navigational items on me, and the path was so straightforward that I wasn't worried about getting lost. My plan was to take 2 days to hike this trail, and then I'd head into one of the big cities and see some of the nightlife. I'd maybe find myself a girl or two to show me around, and then I'd head back home for the end of the week. It was a foolproof plan, and I couldn't wait for my first night in the woods. Everything went perfectly that day. I covered the first 7 miles, and then I set up camp in a small grove of oak trees. I hadn't seen another person out there, and the trail looked less used than I'd expected, but I loved how much wildlife I had seen. I made a fire and heated up one of my dad's MRE dinners, and to my surprise, the military packaged beef stew didn't taste bad at all. Before heading to bed, I made sure that everything was stored away carefully, so that animals wouldn't try to get into anything, and I fell asleep within minutes of crawling into my tent. Sometime later I woke up, and it took me a moment to remember where I was. I lay still trying to figure out what had pulled me out of my slumber, and after a few minutes, I didn't hear anything, so I wrote it off as a dream and fell back into a light sleep. The next time I woke, I could see the moon shining through the tent window, and I could hear soft, lovely music. My first thought was that it sounded like the kind of flute you hear in Celtic songs, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded ethereal and out of sync. It was as though multiple instruments were playing, and the rest of the nocturnal forest sounds had ceased. I untangled myself from my sleeping bag, and I carefully unzipped my tent so that it didn't make any abrupt noise. I didn't think I was in any particular danger, but I wanted to be cautious, since it was admittedly weird to hear random music in the middle of nowhere at roughly 3 a.m. I left my eyes to adjust to the moonlight. With it being a full moon, I could see my campsite well enough. Everything was in place, and I didn't see anyone around. The music sounded like it was coming from off to one of the sides of the clearing, and it didn't sound particularly close. I propped my head back into my tent, long enough to grab my boots and a flashlight. Then I closed the tent behind me and began to follow the music. I was intensely curious, and I figured that if I maintained a good distance from the sound, no one would ever know I were there. I crept along the edge of the clearing, trying to keep to the shadows while making my footfalls light. I followed the haunting music into the darkness, my senses on overdrive as I tried to track it. I wasn't the best woodsman, but I liked to think that I could handle this. After about 10 minutes, I came to a halt, my chest squeezing in a moment of blinding panic. Whomever was playing the music was probably perfectly friendly, but in the off chance that they realized I was defenseless, surely I could always punch them. But that wasn't going to do me much good if they had a weapon, or they could take a hit. I began checking the ground near me, and I soon found a sturdy, thick branch that seemed like it could do some damage if necessary. I tucked it under my arms, cradling it to me as I advanced. It took me another 5 minutes, but I soon found the source of the music. As I got closer, I shut my flashlight off, and I waited to see who was there. It took my brain a moment to process what I was seeing. I had expected a person to be sitting at a campsite playing music, but all I saw was a deer. The clearing it was in was flooded with moonlight, and the flashlight was bright enough that I wished I had a camera with me. After a minute, it raised its head from the berry bush it had been grazing on, and that was when I saw that it wasn't a deer. Its single antler was long and spiraled, almost like that of a gazelle, but I could see that each prong had a hole in it. The antler was acting like a pan flute, since it made a musical sound whenever the breeze blew across them. I studied it in fascination, and that was when I realized we weren't alone. Along the edge of the clearing, several animals had poked their heads out and were cautiously surveying their surroundings. They were all drawn towards the deer-like creature, and they seemed to be as interested in the music as I was. Each time the wind blew, the animal crept a little closer, and soon I could see that there was a weird mix of them. There were a couple of striped hyenas, a snake, some Persian fallow deer, some rabbits, and even a cow. I didn't even realize that Iran had whatever the deer thing was, much less hyenas, so that came as a surprise. As I tried to identify the rest of the animals, a violent gust of wind began blowing, and the once silent animals instantly turned agitated. Over the enraged sounds of hisses, growls, bellows, and thumps, I could hear the music soar, but now it had a heavier, more aggressive quality to it. The animals began turning on each other, and soon it was a war. Biting, clawing, kicking, and stomping began to kill them off, until only 2 animals remained. The cow and one of the hyenas stood panting as they faced off against each other. They were covered in bloody gashes, and the cow looked like it was missing an eye. As the violent song died down, the cow shook its head, as if it were trying to get a fly out of its ear, and the hyena let out a scared, confused whimper. Throughout the carnage, the horned thing had stood in the same spot, and I don't think it had moved a muscle. It finally stepped away from the bush, carefully stepping over the carcasses and gore until it stood in front of the remaining animals. They held their grounds, and the hyena began growling. The deer-like creature shook its head, and a piercing whistle-like sound came from its horn. It startled the animals, who both skittered away, I had no idea what I had just witnessed. It had happened so brutally and quickly that it had been hard to keep track of any one animal, and I had to force myself to keep breathing steadily so that I wouldn't vomit. I had never seen bloodshed like that, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. As I began to back away, the creature daintily made its way into the center of the clearing, and to my disgust, it began feeding on the slain animals. I could hear bones snapping wetly, and that was when my stomach betrayed me. I vomited, and when I finally stopped heaving, it was gone. I could smell the blood and viscera in the air, which sent my stomach into another wave of nauseated cramps. I made my way back to my tent, practically crawling at some points, and that night, I barely slept. What little sleep I did was filled with nightmares, and without hesitation I cut my trip short. When I had internet service again, I spent some time trying to find what the creature was, and it seems like it was a Shadvar. The easiest way to explain it was by calling it a carnivorous unicorn, and they were thought to have gone extinct hundreds of years ago. The type of animals they like eating respond to the sounds of their horn, and that's when it's too late for the prey to escape. It's a fascinating creature, but I hope to never see one again.
I was car camping with friends on the Oregon coast at a designated site in the woods. While I was carrying firewood, our camp neighbor came up and offered to help, and then introduced himself to the group. We invited him over for a beer, and it turns out his name was Jason, and he was a retired boat cook who used to work on fishing ships in Alaska, but now he's traveling the West Coast and staying in campgrounds. Jason was kind of a quiet guy, but as the night went on, he started to get a bit off, acting suspiciously, not really interacting with anyone, staring off into space, and then getting up, walking 2 steps and sitting down again. It started to get pretty late, and we were all getting ready to go to bed. I usually sleep outside in a sleeping bag without a tent unless it's raining or something, so I set up my sleeping bag a little ways away from the fire and pass out. I woke up to Jason standing over me with a weird look on his face, and my friends freaking the hell out. It turns out they all thought he stumbled back over to his campsite, but instead, he went over to me and started stumbling / trying to roll me out of my sleeping bag. I was super pissed off at this point, and tired, and we kicked him out of our campsite while I went to sleep in my friend's tent. Now at this point, I feel that I have to say that these might seem like warning signs, but the Pacific Northwest has some very strange and unstable people, so we honestly didn't think much of it beyond some weirdo getting too drunk and perhaps lost. The next day we all piled into a car to explore the town, and as we leave we see Jason sitting at his campsite, just staring at a lantern across from him. We're gone for about 3 hours, and when we return, Jason is still there, staring at this lantern. We were all making dinner later, when he comes over to our camp with a bottle of vodka and apologized for being so weird the night before. My friend accepted his apology and offered him a burrito, and Jason proceeds to start drinking the vodka and eating with us. Completely different guy. He seems really embarrassed and sorry for the night before. As the night progresses, he's getting quiet again, but I honestly thought at this point perhaps he's just down on his luck. Maybe a touch of alcoholism, and probably pretty harmless. Plus, he wouldn't take a hint to leave. After dinner, I was sitting on a log with my back to the woods, facing the fire. and my friends were all arranged around the campfire on chairs on the other side. Jason was sitting on the log next to me on my right, between me and the group. We're all having a great time and laughing, and as the night goes on, Jason is getting progressively more quiet and seems really angry. Around midnight, I glance over and notice that he's mumbling under his breath. Now I'm the only one close enough to him to sense this change, and I start to try to figure out what he's saying. I follow his gaze and notice that he's staring intently at the axe to the left of me. I didn't want to spook him by moving, but it's about this time that I hear what he's saying, and he's talking about stabbing us all with his knife, over and over again. He's got this really glazed look as he says that he's going to end us. I lock eyes with my friends across the fire, and he notices that something is really wrong and stands up, and I grab the axe and run as fast as I can to the other side of the fire. Jason gets up and starts to run towards us, and my friend, who's a big guy, grabs a hold of him while my other friends take his knife from him. We debated packing up and leaving, but ended up escorting him back to his campsite and sitting in the car until morning when we could report it. The next day at sunrise, when I head over to the camp ranger station, I noticed Jason was completely gone, with all his stuff, even though he'd already paid for 6 more days. I've done my share of deeper backcountry stuff, and seen bears, heard strange noises, and was stalked by a cougar more than once. But to this day, the only experience I've had in the woods that made me wish I had a gun was this one.
Back in primary school, 3rd grade, we had this 3rd grade camp on our school's rugby field on a Friday night. No tents though. We all slept in the clubhouse on the field. It was a lit night. We played games, hide and seek, sang songs, and teased the 3rd grade couples. It was an amazing night, till my group of friends and I went out to hide on the other side of the rugby field, with all the lights turned off. We had 3 flashlights, and being 3rd graders, we were all already in this spooky, scary vibe. We were planning to go hide in the tree, where we spent our breaks during school, but quickly decided otherwise when we saw 2 men. Well, they may have been teenagers, but we were short, and it was quite dark. And ran back to our clubhouse and told the 3 class teachers who were spending the night with us. All us children were called inside the clubhouse for safety and supervision. The male teacher that was with us took a flashlight and went to check if there really were the 2 guys there. And if they were, how? As they must have broken into school, because the only way to get to the field was through the school. We were supposed to close the blinds in order not to see, but I was too curious, so kept peeking under the blind closest to me. To this day, I remember the teacher walking 40 meters until he was behind a tree. From my angle, I could see him. He was just standing there for 2 minutes, then came back and told the other teachers he saw nothing, but that they should call the police just in case. He was too darn scared to check it out himself. Well, I feel you, bro. Anyway, later that night, 2 cops arrived, and a few minutes later, 2 more vans pulled up. We were sent home. Some of the parents weren't happy to come and fetch us at 10 p.m., and the children who didn't have lifts had to go sleep at the teachers' houses. We were never told what the cops found that night. So I did some digging, many years later, as I'm 16 now. The creepy thing was, the Monday that we went to school again, my group and I went to the tree where we saw 2 men. The tree had lots of cuts in it, clearly by some knife. There were also numbers written all over the tree, but the sight of a big body-sized hole covered up with sand made my group and I decide not to sit there anymore. What I found out was that this mentally ill person was coerced to bury a body there that night. We were incredibly close to it when we were playing hide and seek, and I'm so glad we didn't venture any further, as our fates might have been the same as the poor soul who was being put in the ground of our school. This happened to my grandfather in the late 50s. He went camping with some of his buddies and his then girlfriend, my now grandmother. They were out in the middle of nowhere. Back then, there were far more undeveloped areas, and it was pristine wilderness and very deep where they were going. They came across a clearing not too far in and decided to make their camp there. They got all their stuff and started building their camp. They were roasting food over the fire, drinking a few beers, and generally having a good time. It's quiet. Too quiet. All the noises in the forest had suddenly stopped. Everyone seems to have taken notice. They look around and can't see anything peculiar. It was still daylight. It was around 8 p.m., but there was nothing to give any indication that something was wrong. They look around for a little while, seeing if there's anything in the tree line. But after waiting around and seeing nothing, they continue chatting and try to forget about it. That night they fall asleep. The chirping and the animal sounds have come back to some degree, but not like it was before, and everyone is a little bit on edge. My grandfather and grandmother are sharing a tent, and of their friends, one of them goes to pee. They get out of the tent, walk away, and are not heard from in several hours. My grandfather wakes up in the middle of the night, also to pee, and as he's walking out, through the dim embers left in the fire, does he see a lump on the ground that wasn't there before. He darts over, and it's his friend. He's quietly sobbing to himself on the floor. My grandpa shakes him and asks him what's wrong. He's just mumbling, incoherent babble, so he tries to take him into his tent and gets him to sleep. The next morning, everyone wakes up and goes for breakfast. The friend is still in the tent, and when they wake him up and try to talk to him, he reveals something horrifying. He went out to pee in the night when he heard someone calling his name from down the forest. He went down to see who it was, thinking it was another one of the party who'd perhaps gone in a bit further to do their business and maybe were lost, seeing them in the dim embers of the light of the fire. But the further he went down, the more he realized that this person, or this voice, was getting further away. He started shouting to them, telling them that they were getting further away and to stay put. There was no reply. As he got further in, he heard someone almost behind him whisper, "Nearly there." He turned around, and there was nothing there. He ran as fast as he could, but tripped up on a vine and smashed his face to the ground. Although there was no cuts or bruisings, he crawled his way up the top and reached our campsite, and was huddled over just recovering in the dark for a few seconds, trying to lie low to not be seen by whatever it was. That's when my grandfather found him. He says that for the rest of the night, he stayed up until he passed out, listening, hearing the voice in the woods occasionally call out his name. "Roger, Roger, I'm waiting." He never went camping again, My grandfather swears this story's true, as the look on Roger's face was one of absolute terror, and there's no way that this honest, hard-working man would ever make something up like that. They didn't go camping again. I've been camping once, and never will again. So a few friends and I planned a trip to take our Enos to a camping ground and stay there the night. We got there, set up, made some s'mores and whatnot, and went to bed. Being the dumb high schoolers that we were, we did not check the weather, and it began to thunderstorm very badly about an hour into sleeping. We all rushed into my car, all 6 of us, and sat there for about an hour. After the storm passed, we got out and began trying to set up again. I hadn't taken more than 2 steps out the car when we heard a loud crash off in the distance. My first instinct was to get back to the car, but we came to the consensus that we should investigate. So we took some flashlights and walked down the road, about 500 yards, to find that a huge tree had crashed on a couple's Airstream. They were outside of it with their dogs, and the woman was shaking because she said the trunk landed about 2 feet from her head. We ended up calling the very reluctant park ranger, who came to take a look. He let us out of the campground, and we just drove back to one of our friends' houses for the night. It's really scary. I'm not sure what would have happened if we went down the road and had found the lady's head smashed in by that tree trunk. When I was a kid, my family took a giant camper pop-up tent thing around Europe. We were stationed in Germany in the late 70s. At the time, it was our summer vacation, and we spent it in the wagon, hauling the camper and camping through different countries. There were always interesting things happening at campgrounds. One time, we were almost flooded out by a flash flood/rainstorm along the Loire Valley. Another time, all of our shoes were filled with slugs. But the scary one was somewhere back in France. We were camping at some campgrounds that were on some really old property. Right in the middle of the campground, there was this really old abandoned chateau. It wasn't really that big. You could see in the windows. All the wallpaper was peeling off the walls. Some rooms that you could see into had ragged curtains and a few pieces of furniture. The doors were locked up with chains and had a no trespassing sign in the front in French. My brother and sister and I were playing around the old place at dusk, peeking in the windows until we were called back to the tent for the night. There were probably about 10 other campsites with people in that night. Later, at around 1 a.m., I had to pee really bad. I was old enough to be allowed to take my flashlight and walk to the bathroom by myself, so I quietly unzipped my tent and headed out with my flashlight. I had to go right by that creepy house. I skirted by the house as fast as possible. On my way back, I passed by the house and someone else was walking diagonally from me, and their flashlight reflected on the windows. I glanced over at the light, and there was a giant figure in the window, just behind the curtains that the light illuminated. It was thick and dark, and had white eyes that blinked at me for a second. The person's flashlight moved over pretty fast, and within seconds, the figure was gone. I never ran back to the tent so fast in my life. My mum said she heard me coming when she heard my flip-flops flapping like crazy back to the tent. I would only talk about it in the morning, when it was light again.
I've got a good through-hiking crew. We've done pieces of the Appalachian Trail, some Florida swamp, and a good amount in Maine. we consider ourselves pretty experienced. 2 of us are military. The other 2 are just fun to have around. So with that said, we emphasize preparation. This was probably 2015. We planned a 10-day trip in West Virginia along a river the weeks after Christmas. This is our favorite time to camp, because 1, we're all home, 2, bugs aren't around, and 3, no one else is stupid enough to camp at that time of year. We've done the trail before and felt comfortable with the forecast. Highs in the low 30s, lows in the teens, nothing we couldn't handle. We set off. Weather is great. The trail we're on is a 26-mile loop, handrailing a river most of the way. We eventually get to the spot we mapped out on the second day, about 14 miles in, and get ready to chill and do man stuff for the week. We rock out of the woods doing the usual for us, cutting wood, hopping into the river, hunting, fishing, writing, and the like. Now we've been out there before, and have explored perhaps a 3x3 square grid radius, and we didn't hear or sense the presence of anyone else near there. Things start to get gnarly. I'll get into the paranormal first though. It's 5 a.m. and we start getting into our morning routine. One of the guys heads the 10 meters down the river to catch breakfast. One starts checking on the NOAA forecast on the radio, and one starts to unfreeze our water filter. And I'm pulling out the morning firewood. I'm restarting our fire as it gets brighter. I notice there's this gorgeous pair of black labs rummaging around the outskirts of our camp. Pleasantly surprised, we are all pumped to find some pups, because we're idiots and none of us care where they came from. Within seconds, this raggedy looking West Virginia guy appears out of nowhere by a tree, shotgun over the shoulder, sweet jean jacket on, and a cowboy hat. The good West Virginian look that I respect. He says morning and that we have a nice fire. The way he said it was chilling. We all felt like we could see right through him. We asked him how he got there. Mind you, the sun is barely peeking through the woods, and we're 14 miles in nowhere forest. And we haven't seen a trace of anyone in 5 days. The man says nothing, looks at us and turns to walk out into the dawn, with the dogs following. We're standing there dumbfounded, and when we find our pulse, immediately start looking from where he came from and which direction he was heading. Obviously we found nothing. No tracks, not even the dogs. But now to the survival part. We had snow in the forecast for most of the week, which we had almost every day. Not too much, maybe only 4 inches through the week, but we noticed it had started to get warmer. We're laying down for the night, checking our nightly forecast, and they're talking about the snow coming in for the night. No worries in our mind, at least it's not rain. False. We had limited cloud cover the day before, and the air was still pretty warm that night. The snow turned into rain. We hadn't taken rain precautions before we bedded down, since we were just expecting snow. We wake up around 3 a.m., packs and boots dripping. We get up to start getting an emergency plan together. The temperature is dropping, and we're wet. Precip turns to ice, with a whole day of precip ahead of us. We end up packing everything up, try to sanitize our area, but one of the guys starts going down. He's really lean, so he's pretty susceptible to cold weather injuries. We get all our dry clothing off us and get him into them. We propped up a makeshift shelter of boughs and tarps and an emergency blanket for him while we finished getting ready to step off. We rucked the 14 miles back to our car that morning and drove the 4 hours back. Lesson learned, it always rains.
About 20 years ago, a friend and I were hiking on the AT in northern Georgia. We camped at a place called Indian Graveyard. There were no graves there, just the stumps of fallen trees that had died due to an infestation. But it looked like a graveyard. It was early spring, and the weather was kind of sketchy. That night, as we were going to sleep in the tents, the wind was blowing pretty hard. Suddenly it stopped, like a switch had been thrown. We sat up, concerned that something bad was about to happen weather-wise. As we sat there listening, we heard footsteps outside the tent. They moved slowly around the tent from the right, behind on the left, then stopped at the front. We were terrified. Without warning, my friend Donnie shouted at the top of his lungs, "You better get the hell out of here. I have a gun, and I'll blow your damn head off." Well, he didn't have a gun, and he scared the crap out of me for screaming like that. He told me later he thought the footsteps might have been a drunk redneck messing with us, or someone trying to get up to no good. Right after he screamed, a huge round light flared on. It was about 10 feet off the ground, about 10 feet in diameter, a perfect circle of blinding light, so bright we could see it through the orange tent material. Silently, it floated there without moving for what seemed like hours, and with no warning the light went out, and when it did, at the exact same time, the wind started blowing again. With only one flashlight, Donnie and I abandoned our camp and ran nearly a mile to where our car was parked. We got in and drove to Helen, a little mountain town about 8 miles away. We parked in a parking lot and stayed in the car until morning. Right after sunrise, we went back to our camp. Nothing was missing, but we did find the ground disturbed around the tent by holes in the ground, about an inch in diameter, each evenly spaced around the tent. Each hole was about 6 inches deep. We grabbed all of our stuff and went home. To this day, I haven't been back to Indian Graveyard, and doubt I ever will. I live in northeastern Oklahoma, and I consider myself a camping/fishing enthusiast. One spring night, me and 2 friends decided to go fishing. It's around midnight. We're going to a place that was once a maintained primitive camping area. This is not a remote location, but it's not very well known either. As we approach the turnoff for our spot, we see another vehicle slowly turning out of it, and proceeding in the way in which we came. We pass them, and a friend says how he figured no one else would be around. We get to our spot, get our gear out, and begin to prepare. But as we chat, drink a few beers, we all notice an unspoken uneasiness. Something is just not right. Usually I'm a trooper, fishing until the sun comes up, but I'm the first to crack. I explain to my friends how I feel, and that we should leave, and that I have a bad feeling. They agree. We load up, and while slowly driving through the old campground, we notice some brightly glowing embers in an area that no one has been. My friend who's driving stops without even thinking, and goes for a look. He's startled, telling us to come see. What we saw were the remains of 3 crosses made of wood that would stand about 12 inches if upright. They had been burned along with the small campfire. And to make it even better, we were all lying on freshly turned soil, which resembled a freshly dug grave. We freaked, got the hell out of there fast. Thank you, sweet baby Jesus, that we are home free, was all I thought. When we approached the exit of the old campground, we noticed a vehicle parked on the side of the road. We passed it, and realized it was the same car we passed on the way in. There was no one in the car. They had doubled back, and were likely watching us, waiting to do who knows what. I live in Utah. I went hiking up the Bonneville Shoreline Trail that used to be the shore of Lake Bonneville ages ago. This day, I picked a different trail to follow, one I had never been on before. After hiking for a few miles up this trail, I came around a bend and I see true trees that had apparently been uprooted or fallen, and they were placed over the trail in a way that made it look like an archway. That by itself wasn't weird, but there were two big elk skulls placed on the end of each tree, placed just so that the empty eye sockets of the skull were looking directly at you as you passed under the trail. I thought that was kind of weird, but whatever. Probably just some people thinking they're funny. I shrugged it off and kept going. But as soon as I passed through the threshold of the archway, a cold chill shot up my spine, and I felt my hackles rise instantly, and goosebumps all over my body. I kept going for a little while, because I didn't want to go back yet, but the whole time I was walking, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. It had me feeling really tense. I walked for a good 10 minutes before I decided to turn around. As I'm walking back, maybe 5 minutes later, it gets real quiet very suddenly. All of the birds stopped chirping. All of the little animals around stopped moving. It even seemed like the wind died down at that moment too. Total silence. My dad was a real big hunter when I was younger, so I'm very familiar with the idea that sudden quiet in the wilderness is generally bad news. By this point, I had a white-knuckle grip on the hilt of my big survival knife as I kept walking down the trail. I passed through the archway again and honestly broke into a full-on sprint. I didn't see anything, but there was something there. I was being stalked. I could feel the eyes still even as I ran down the trail. I haven't been back to that trail since that day. I don't know what it was that was stalking me, but there was something there, and I don't want to find out what it was. When I was a kid, around 6 or 7, my parents would take my brother and I camping all the time. There was one time where we were camped out in the middle of this forest, where you could pay to have your own section on the trail. My dad picks one that is at the end of the trail, so that we don't have people walking past us in the morning to go to the restroom/showers. Probably the second night we were there, my dad lets us stay up till 12:30, which is a big deal when you're a kid. He's telling us all these scary stories, and we're having the time of our life. Just as we're about to go to bed, we see a figure biking towards us. I figure that it's a park ranger, or someone like that, to see if we're doing alright. Nope. This guy, who is completely hammered, gets off his bike and starts walking towards our site. As he's walking up, I see that he has a rifle on his shoulders. He begins by saying something like, "Why you guys have my spot?" and all this weird shit about how he stays here every night. My dad politely asks him to leave, but I can tell my dad is starting to tense up. This guy starts completely going off on my dad. My dad stands up, and the guy moves for his rifle on his back. As soon as that happens, my dad reaches into the fire and throws a log at the dude. Then my dad tackles him and told my mum and brother and I to run for the park rangers. We run and tell the rangers, who are already looking for the guy, and they go and help my dad. My dad was taken in for questioning and let off the next morning. His hands were bruised as hell, but he had no burn marks. A year ago, a group of us went camping in Kearney, Ontario, where we always go camping. Whenever we go, we always form our tents in a big circle, with the fire pit in the middle of us. We've been drinking, smoking a few joints, and a few of us were tripping balls on shrooms. The first night we were there, this guy randomly walks into our circle, introduces himself, and says that he was in the military and decided to take some vacation to camp out for a bit. He asked if he could join our fire, as it was getting late and he didn't buy any firewood. Being the friendly, stoned people we are, we let him join our fire. He even pitched in some money for the firewood. The night went on, and we were all having a good time. One by one, our group started heading off to bed, me being either the second or third. I remember waking up to the sound of someone talking and the fire being started. It was 4 a.m, and I peeped out my tent and saw the random just sitting on a log by the fire, talking to himself. Still tripping on shrooms, I thought to myself that I was in no condition to deal with this and chalked it up to just me tripping out. I wake up the next day, and everyone is thankfully still alive, and the fire is smouldering. We look to the next campsite, where the random was staying, and it was spotless. No garbage, no tracks in the trail around the site, no nothing. We started talking about him just to be sure we all saw him. Through talking, we managed to figure out that he must not have slept at all. The last 2 of our group passed out just after 3:30. The first person got up just after 6 and noticed he was gone. The rest of our camping trip went well, and we all went home. Fast forward maybe 4 to 5 years. I flip on the news, and there's a picture of someone I could swear I recognize. He was arrested for a bunch of crimes, including sexual assault and murder. Guess who it was? It was the random guy who joined our fire. I don't know why I remembered his face, but I guess it was just a weird situation where my brain right-clicked and saved a JPEG in my brain. Now, I have no way of proving if it was the same guy. We didn't take any pictures of the random, but the picture jump started my memory and made me instantly remember the weird random fire joiner. Either that, or they looked identical. Either way, it was profoundly creepy. This happened to my mother in the 80s. Her parents had died when she was young, and her auntie, who had looked after her while she was growing up, had suddenly died from a tumor. Things weren't going well, as my auntie was heavily in debt, and my mother had to sell pretty much everything that she owned in order to try and pay them off, which she couldn't even do in the end. This left her homeless, and with the little money she had, she bought a tent and ended up camping in the woods on the outskirts of our city. She had a rough start, and this wasn't ideal, but she found a job waitressing at a local strip club nearby. They had showers which she could use, and she was very grateful just to get clean, she told me. There was one time at about 3 a.m. as she was finishing up her shift that she was making her way back. That night, a guy had been trying to talk to her, but all my mother could think of was about getting this money this month so that she could hopefully try and find somewhere to rent, as living in a tent is not only dangerous, but damn right horrible. You can't fit your life into a small plastic sheet, as she put it. Anyway, this guy was following her home. He kept telling her that she was beautiful and that he wanted to take her out, but my mom wasn't interested and told him to please leave and that she was waiting for her husband to pick her up by the forest. She knew that she couldn't make it back to her campsite because this guy would find her, and it's not like she had any protection or security. So she went in a different direction and just kept on walking. The guy, probably slightly drunk, still persisted, and she was getting very agitated. That's when out of nowhere he broke out into a run, and my mum defaulted to run back to her camp. She ran as fast as she could and said that she lost the guy. When she made it into her tent, she turned out her flashlight and just lied there, silently. She didn't even want to get into the sleeping bag because she didn't want to make the noise, and was conscious of every sound around her as it permeated through the tent as she listened in silence. Growing ever more nervous, she waited until she passed out from the fear. She doesn't know what time this happened, but she woke up in the middle of the night. It was still dark, and she could hear footsteps gently rustling near her tent. She was bricking it at this point, confident it was the man from earlier. She tried to squint, but without any light, it would be impossible to see, as this guy didn't have a flashlight either. How the hell could he have found her tent, she thought. Maybe he turned on the flashlight before. She laid there, getting ready to die, or ready to embrace whatever dark plans this sicko had. She didn't even have any protection. No knife, no gun, nothing. Perhaps the blunt end of the flashlight could do some damage, but it was light, cheap plastic, and she severely doubted it. As she waited in silence, the footfalls padded away, and she stayed alert, waiting for them to return. It was when the first signs of daylight started to break through that she got the courage to exit her tent and look around. She didn't find anything amiss, but as she was getting up to go pee, did she see a paper on the ground that wasn't there when she arrived. It was a flyer from where she worked, and scribbled on the back was an ominous message. "Be here tomorrow, and I'll kill you." It didn't take her long to abandon her tent, and she slept round one of her co-workers' houses for the next few nights. That ended up turning out to be 2 years, as they ended up getting along pretty well. And she finally got enough money to get her own place and met my dad. And that's a story for another time. My mum doesn't like to dwell on what happened, but she knows very well she got lucky, as that guy managed to track her down and she was defenseless. He could have done horrific things while she was asleep. Who knows? If he'd have gotten his own way, I don't think I'd have a mum or be here to share her story. This is the most insane thing to ever happen to me, and it is 100% true. Let me give you a slight backstory. We go to the desert in Glamis, California. It's a very busy desert. Hundreds of thousands could be there at any time, especially holiday weekends such as New Year. Glamis has meetup spots. One of those is called Oldsmobile Hill. It's a gigantic sand dune that hundreds of people meet up at and race up. Some people literally race some big trucks to try and see if they'll make it up the hill and get stuck. People on quads, buggies, dirt bikes, and everything in between go up this hill and mess around on it. Well, as you can imagine, it got a little crazy. Alcohol and horsepower don't mix, so there were a lot of accidents. And the BLM decided more cops and shutting down Oldsmobile around 9 PM before things got nuts for safety reasons. Side note, my dad once stumbled upon a wreck where the people were decapitated by another buggy. Like I said, it can be very dangerous. But the interesting part was that all the cops had SUVs at the time, so all you needed to do to outrun the cops was to go through the dunes. Their vehicles couldn't follow. So here we are, Oldsmobile shuts down at night, cops in SUVs monitoring the area, more trying to keep it safe. Now to the actual story. I was 9 years old. It was New Year's weekend out in Glamis. There are large areas to camp, and everyone just kind of crams around each other in circles. So we're at camp. It's night. Night riding can be even more dangerous, and usually when you have young kids, you don't go out after dark. All the adults are drinking, and we had a large camp with maybe 25 people and 5 motorhomes. That weekend, someone brought a famous NASCAR/Baja racer. It was pretty cool. He brought his NASCAR lookout tower gigantic semi-truck 5th wheel trailer. Anyway, the adults were all drunk at this point. My stepmom and dad got into some huge blowout fight. Who knows what about? They always fought. But all of a sudden, my dad starts taking the top off our buggy like he's gonna leave. I know he's drunk, everyone knows he's drunk, and we try and tell him to stop, but he doesn't. Let me explain about the buggy we had. It has 1,110 horsepower, so this is not some play toy. My dad jumps into the buggy despite our attempts to stop him and takes off. It's night, so my stepmom and I are a bit worried. Everyone was in the middle of camp by a fire, and all witnessed him take off, all mad the way he did. Hours go by, hours. My stepbrother had gone to bed as well as all the other kids in camp had, except for me. I'm still sitting by the fire with most of the adults. I think they all wanted to know if he'd come back safely, and we're waiting. So like I said, it'd been a long time, maybe 3 hours, and it was quite late, maybe midnight. I'm freaking out, but quiet, as is my stepmom. Some of the people were whispering about it. When out of nowhere my dad comes flying into camp, I mean at least going 60, and slams on his brakes being all dramatic. He jumps out of the buggy, and starts yelling at my stepmom to come help him put the tarp back over the buggy quickly. He's doing all of this in front of everyone, and they're all staring. We start asking him where he'd been, and he just shushes us and says basically nothing about anything. Now that the buggy is hidden under the tarp, he goes and puts on a hoodie, puts the hoodie up, and sits at the fire away from any openings in the circle of the camp. Weird, everyone was whispering. Even I can see something is very wrong. He's acting super shifty and freaked out, and wouldn't tell anyone what happened. Do you see where I'm going with this? He left drunk in a monster of a vehicle at night. Did he hit someone? Did he hit something and dip? What could he have done? Some of the people there were assholes, and I overheard them talking about that, and then I knew how truly serious the situation might be. So, now he's been back at camp for about 20 minutes. People are starting to go to bed, and all of a sudden, the piercing sounds come from everywhere and nowhere. Blue and red flashing lights come flying into every single angle of our camp, sirens blaring, as 10 cop cars literally pull right up to the campfire. Meanwhile, I had gone into our motorhome to get some sleep, but obviously ran outside in an instant when I saw all of this happening. The cops had megaphones and were calling my dad's name, saying he needed to stand up, put his hands on his head, and walk backwards slowly. All the spotlights beaming on him. I tried to run to him, but some guy in our camp grabbed the back of my jacket just in time and pulled me back. I started screaming for my dad. My stepmom launches herself in front of my dad's outstretched arms, screaming and asking what he did. The cops were ignoring her and just commanding my dad to walk backwards slowly to their SUVs. As if all of this wasn't enough, a helicopter starts circling our camp with a spotlight directly on the cops and my dad, circling over and over. My dad gets to the cops and gets handcuffed. I'm screaming. My stepmom is screaming, about to get herself arrested because she's drunk and going nuts. My dad's about to get into the cop car when all of a sudden the cop says something over the radio, and the helicopter microphone comes on, and the pilot says, "Thanks for the ride, John," and takes off. The cops start cracking up. My dad's on the ground laughing, and everyone is freaking stunned silent. Like, What? We have absolutely no idea what's going on. The cops all shake hands with my dad. We're all just standing there so confused, and the cops leave. I shit you not. It was a prank. One of the most terrifying things to ever happen to me was a damn prank. We come to find out my dad had just drove around for a while to cool off, sobered up, and decided to go to Oldsmobile Hill after hours so that he could have it all to himself. He comes over the hill, and there are cops everywhere, and a little flight helicopter. They stop him, and he thought for sure he was in trouble, but they ask him for a ride. They were the cops and helicopter for Life Flight, and were just basically waiting around for some sort of emergency. My dad took all 10 cops and the pilot up Oldsmobile Hill over and over, racing up and launching over the top, scaring the hell out of all of them. When they are all done, one of the cops jokingly asks what they could do to repay him for the fun. And my crazy dad somehow got them to pull a full-scale invasion on our camp. I guess they had nothing better to do. So they did. It scared the absolute hell out of me and everyone there. It was the damn most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. Then I was completely scarred by that event for a couple of years, waking up in the middle of the night and screaming for my dad in my dreams. Yeah. Thanks, Dad. I was 13 and in a wilderness treatment program for behavioral stuff. The place was out in the mountains of southern Utah, by a place called Joe's Camp. Plenty of weird stuff happened out there, and I have a few stories, but this freaked me out the most, and the physical feeling I got, I can still conjure up today. One night we were sitting around the fire telling scary stories, and the topic of Wendigos came up. Some swore up and down that they were real, and one staff member said they were old tales of encounters in the area. We bantered about it for a few minutes, and then, being the edgy teen I was, I blurted out something like, "Screw a Wendigo, I'll kill one with my bare hands if it shows itself." Then later that night, when I was asleep, I had this dream. I was basically watching this deer in a clearing, and I had the worst feeling ever of doom. And then suddenly this deer is crushed, I mean obliterated, like I really can't describe it. It was kind of sucked up under a big rock, and its spinal cord flew out and impaled me. And I got the feeling when I was impaled, and it was the worst and weirdest pain I've ever had. The best way to describe it was like a dirty scraping feeling. I was then, in the dream, looking at my feet out at the end of my tarp tent, and I was ripped out the tent. I woke up suddenly and was sitting in my sleeping bag outside my tent, making the strangest noise I've ever heard. It was like a wheezing screech, a primal death cry. I looked around, quickly crawled back to my tent, and wrote it off as a bad dream, and didn't really speak about it while I was there. I don't know how to plausibly explain it, other than a weird dream and sleepwalking, but it definitely jarred me, and when I remember it, I can't help but feel incredibly uneasy. My property is pretty old. We bought it from an old couple who gave up on it after a tornado destroyed the silos, barns, and a couple of sheds. We spent years fixing it back up, but only one of the barns got rebuilt. The other is still collapsed. The shed is worn down, and the door is blown out, which makes it always scary walking by a dark shed with an empty opening. This silo fell over, and is next to the shed, which is across from the two barns. All of this was on my walk to a deer stand in the furthest field in the back of my property. I was a freshman in college at the time, and hunted until it was dark. I left the stand and started quietly walking back. I always had an eerie feeling walking by the torn down barns, but at night, it's always way worse. I forgot to mention there's an old well with a concrete slab on the top of it, but the concrete siding had a hole. It always gave me the chills. As I'm walking by the wells and barns, everything is super quiet. I all of a sudden jolted my eyes to the fence along the field by the shed. I heard a chain whipping sound and faint giddy laughter. When I looked up, I saw two men in prison gang garments, white and black striped suits, quickly galloping away from me alongside the fence. Both were laughing and had chains on their hands and feet. I quickly fell to the ground and loaded my rifle in terror. I looked through my scope where I saw them running alongside at last. It was the biggest field on our property, so they had another 100 yards to go alongside the fence before they hit the woods, but they were gone. I laid there searching for 10 minutes before chalking it up to being sleep deprived from the morning hunt. I never had experienced something so real, or did I imagine it? I am a 32-year-old man, yet, as I say this in broad daylight, it still haunts me, to the point that merely thinking about it, or in this case, sharing the memory, is enough to send chills down my body and make me feel like a terrified child. I have only shared this experience with a handful of people over the past 10 years, because of how terrifying of an experience it was. But I feel like it can be therapeutic to get it off my chest and share it with others. Perhaps others have had similar experiences. To tell this story and to give it justice, I have to tell you of an experience that happened 3 years before the terrifying encounter. Buckle up, this will be long. My name is Joshua, and I live in Arkansas, and in late 2003, near the middle of fall, right before it started getting really cold, my wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugarloaf Lake in Oklahoma. I say camp, but the actual plan was to meet at Sugarloaf, and my friend, Bob, wanted to take me and my wife around to some paranormal places in the Sugarloaf area. So we got there around 7 p.m. I was driving a white Ford 1996 F-150. Bob was driving a 1980-something white Celebrity, which was a really piece of rubbish vehicle. Anywho, it was late, dusk becoming dark, and we all climbed into Bob's car, and he took us around the area, first to an old abandoned house. But other than some raccoons just rustling around, it was a waste of 2 hours. Then he took us to a graveyard that was supposedly haunted. Again, it was a bust. Then an old church that was run down. Yawn. Nothing. At this point, it was getting close to midnight, and my wife and I were pretty bored. And I spoke up to Bob, saying, "Man, this really hasn't been that freaky of a night." That's when Bob smiled, saying that he was saving the best for last. He handed me a few Polaroid pictures of a hillside covered in trees and daylight. I asked him what it was, and he asked me if I saw a house or any type of light pole or anything in the picture, to which I replied, no. He took the picture back and said that's because there isn't, and there's no power lines either. About this time, he turned down an old dirt road and passed a small house. Then after that, It was 2 miles of dirt road with woods on either side of a barbed wire fence. On the other, with about 2 acres of field connecting to a wooded hillside. Nothing to light the night except the full moon above, and the clear starry sky. After what seemed like forever, he stopped the car and told us to all get out. We did as he said. He walked us to the side of the car, where the fence, field, and wooded hillside was. He looked at his cell phone, which, his phone and my phone, had no signal. This was 03, and this area had no cell towers, but he looked at his phone and it read 11:57. He told us all to watch the middle of the hillside. Even in the complete darkness, I could tell that it was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing had changed. Then at exactly midnight, a small flickering light goes off in the middle of the hillside. A chill runs down my back as my wife, Bob, and his girlfriend and myself watch this small light, which to me looked like an old kerosene lantern, begin to move, swaying back and forth. We watched in complete silence for what seemed like several minutes, when I finally spoke up and asked what the story was with this. Bob replied he didn't know, but locals had told him that at midnight every night, this lantern would light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun comes up and then it disappears. Nobody knew what the story was. At the time, I was a 19-year-old guy who didn't think anything would scare or hurt me. So, since there were no homes around, I yelled out, "We see you now. Not so scary with your little lantern." Bob hushed me, but it was too late. My wife screamed and pointed. I was laughing, but my laughter stopped as I looked up to the hillside to see the lantern swaying back and forth, but moving down the hillside towards the field at an inhuman pace. Gliding. It began to speed across the field towards the car. We didn't stick around to see what it was, because within a second we were in the car flying down the dirt road back to the lake. We looked back and saw the lantern slowly moving back up the hillside to where it first appeared. The ride back was silent, until Bob spoke up, saying, "Crap, I forgot to put gas in earlier, and the only store around is closed. And if we decided to go back out anywhere, it would be best to take my truck until he could get gas in it in the morning, as he only had about half a quarter tank left." I said okay, and a few minutes later we arrived back at Sugarloaf Lake. We had parked by the lake docks, and we dropped my tailgate and sat and spoke about what had just happened. Bob's girlfriend was pregnant at the time, and told him she was hungry. He told her we had brought some snacks, but he said she needed actual food. But since the local store was closed, he asked if he could take my truck to the next town over to get some food, because his car wouldn't have enough gas to get us into town. I obliged. We shut our cooler, put the tailgate up, and loaded into my truck. I turned the key and nothing happened. My truck was dead. Deader than dead. No ding, no lights, no clicking noise. Nothing, for all intents and purposes. You would think that the alternator was out. This was strange, and after the night we had been through, it made us feel very uneasy. We got out of the truck and popped the hood. We pulled Bob's car around to the front and attempted to jumpstart my truck with his car. This is where it gets even weirder. As soon as we connected the jump cables to his battery and mine, his girlfriend starts his car, and within a second of the cables in between, the connectors start to smoke, and in a flash of fire, they burn up, and within a few seconds, they were nothing more than bits of melted rubber and ash.
with only the end clamps still on our batteries. Bob runs and turns off his car engine, and we take the clamps off our batteries. We look at each other in the early moon and starlit night. Did I mention there were no light poles around? And we both get a bad feeling at the exact same time as we suddenly realize we had been hearing a distant noise in the lake that was getting louder. It was like a motorboat. Now, like I said, this was the time of year it was starting to get cold, especially at night. We were bundled up as it was, and we were standing still on land at night. But somebody was out on a boat after midnight? When it had to be chilly, as there's all that wind hitting them. And from the sound of this motor it was going pretty fast, but we saw nothing. That is until the boat was about 50 yards away, and a very bright spotlight comes on, temporarily blinding us all. Bob and I tell the women to get into his car and lock the doors. I reach into the bed of my truck and give Bob a tire tool, and I pick up another, as I work at a tire shop and had all kinds of tools of the trade in my truck. We were standing in front of the vehicles in the middle, the hoods up on both as the boats pull up to the dock, and two heavily bearded men in their 30s to 40s step out of the boat and walk up. It's hard to give an accurate description, as their spotlight was still pointed to us, and it covered the men in an eerie shadow whilst blinding Bob and I. They look at us, at our vehicles, and one glances in the direction of the car, at the women, and then back at us, and lets out a small chuckle. "You fellas got into some sort of car trouble?" one asks as he lights up a cigarette. "Yeah, but it's nothing we can't handle," I stammer. The guy with the cigarette sniffs the air and looks down between Bob and I's feet and sees the still smoking ashes of what used to be the jump cable. "Looks like it was more than your terrible jump cables could handle. Y'all need some help?" We got some tools on the boat that I think could help fix you guys' problem right up. Then the other man who had chuckled in the beginning says, fix them right up. I'm speechless at this moment, and my mouth is probably hanging agape. I can't remember as the two men walked back to their boat, and we heard what sounds like chains rattling around as we try to make out what they're doing, but the spotlight was so blinding we could barely see. Anyway, the chain noise was enough, and Bob looked at me without saying a word, and we both jumped into his car and drove the hell out of there. For the next few hours we drove to a populated area of the houses, which wasn't mainly in the rural area we were pretty much stuck in, since we had very little fuel. But we all sat in the car mostly quiet, looking around in all directions in near panic, thinking that at any given moment those men would find us. It had been a very scary ordeal. Bob would turn his headlights on every now and then, thinking he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while the women fell asleep, and Bob and I spoke about how strange this all was, and he laughed, saying, "I told you it would be a scary night. I just didn't know if it would be this sort of scary." At this point the paranormal lantern wasn't even the main thing freaking me out, but the men never showed, and eventually the morning was on its way, and it was about 20 minutes until sunrise, and Bob asked if I wanted to go see if the lantern really disappears at sunrise. I asked if he was sure he had enough gas to get there, and he said yeah,
The local store opens up in about an hour, so that'll be fine. I tell him in that case, then yes. We wake the women up and drive back to the hillside. We get there with about 4 minutes left of sunrise, and we still see the lanterns swaying in the woods. Bob looks at me and I smile and do the motion for zipping my lips, as we all watch in wonder, as right as the sunrise hits the hills, does the lantern slowly fade away into nothing. After this, we get back in the car and drive back to the lake, feeling safer now. When we get there, there is no sign of the boat, and the hood of my truck is still up, and the doors are still locked. On a whim, I tell Bob I'm going to try and start the truck one more time before he drives us somewhere, where I can get a cell signal and call for help. And I'll be damned, the truck started right up there and then without hesitation. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise and counting our blessings, and swearing to leave the paranormal investigating in the area to others, and swearing that we never wanted to come back to this area and run into the boat people again. However, all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I haven't seen in almost 2 years at that point, calls me up and says he has a proposition for me. He goes on to tell me he has a group of himself and 3 other Wiccans who go out and do seances in haunted places, and asked me if I'd be willing to film one of their sessions in a haunted place for their records, and that they would even pay for my services. I am no Wiccan, but I've always loved the paranormal. Even after what I went through at Sugarloaf, I still had an itch to scratch when it came to getting scared and dealing with the paranormal and the unknown, and I told him yes, I would love to go with them, but I had no interest in joining in, but was okay with watching and just getting to be out there and looking into the paranormal once again. So of course my next question was, when and where we were going to be doing this. When he answered, I got a terrible gut feeling. And I wish so much that I had trusted my gut and told him that I had changed my mind. Remember that lantern light out near Sugarloaf? As if there were any way I could forget. Yeah? Why? I told my group this story, and they want to do the ritual there and see if we can contact the spirit and find out what it is and why it's there, Bob replied. I don't know, man. Oh, come on, Josh, trust me, you'll be safe. I'm going to pay you $250 in cash just to sit there and film it. At this time, I was about to become a father, and money was tight due to diapers, formula, and everything involved in being a parent does cost a small fortune. Not to mention it was my first kid and my new wife's first kid, so she had been going crazy spending money on not just the necessities, but also buying only top-of-the-line baby products, like toys, cribs, playpen, baby monitors, strollers, car seat, combination packs, and play/changing tables, diaper genie, designer baby clothes. So, because my wife was putting us in the poorhouse, I had to weigh out my fear of the area as less important, because it's what I needed to make the extra money. So, against my better judgment, I accepted the offer, and a week later, I was in the same seat beat-down celebrity Bob was driving 3 years earlier. This time with Bob and 2 other guys and 1 girl that were complete strangers to me. They each were dressed very gothic and had these pentagram necklaces. It was 11:50 when we got there, and the 4 of them sat in a tight circle, and I was behind them to the right, about 5 feet from the barbed fence that was in front of the field that led to the hillside, and my back was to the hillside and bushes at the fence line, and I was filming my friends circle as they all started chanting something. As I have been sharing this entire post, I have been getting knots in my stomach, knowing that I was coming to this part of the story. This part of the story still haunts my dreams, and even waking hours to this day. I'm going to do my best to describe how the following unfolded. I know
that mere words cannot do justice to the pure terror that ensued, or how horribly horrific the events surrounding were. So, when listening to this, turn your imagination all the way up, and believe me when I say this is a turning point in my life, and I was interested in the paranormal. It was a fun hobby to go out ghost hunting or get myself spooked or whatever, but after this night, I will never look at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore, or whatever. But after this night, I never looked at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore. I just show respect and stay as far away from it as possible, as there is so much dread just trying to share this. As his group are chanting, Bob lights up this huge candle in the middle of them and opens up some sort of book. It's not like a scary antique spell book or anything like that. He starts reciting words from it, and then he looks at his phone and tells the group to be quiet and to look at him. I turn the camera, and at midnight on the dot, the lantern appears. One member of Bob's group blurts out, "Cool." I roll my eyes. Since the way these people were dressed and the way they carried themselves, the word didn't seem to fit into their vocabulary. Then Bob says to his group to join hands as they attempt to communicate with the spirit. I turn my back to the light and begin to film the group as they began again chanting, and Bob reads from the book. They then start asking questions in hopes the spirit will respond. About this time, a wind picks up, and Bob's candles go out. He tells everyone to hold on and tells me to cut the camera for a minute, and I oblige and stop recording as I watch Bob as he tries with his lighter. Then 2 lighters from his group, but none of them are working. I'm sitting down watching the group when I start hearing rustling behind me. I jump up, leaving the camera on the ground, and spin around. Bob and his group are preoccupied with their candle and lighter problem, and as I spin around, I'm blinded by the brightest light I've ever seen. What I believe was the lantern close up and personal, but as quick as it had appeared, the light was gone, and the lantern was nowhere to be seen. If it had been the lantern that blinded me, it had moved from the hillside across the field and right behind me without me realizing it in the span of 30 seconds. I looked around for the lantern on the hillside and nothing. It was midnight, and the lights have always stayed on the hillside. At this moment, the wind quits blowing, and I hear Bob's lighter finally flick and see it light up, and I mutter, guys, did you see that?" They all turn and ask what I'm talking about. But before I can answer them, we all stopped dead in our tracks by a distant laughter coming from somewhere, everywhere, and nowhere. It was all around us nearly. And this is no ordinary laughter. This laughter sounds like the laughter of hundreds, even thousands of children to haunt me at this very moment. As I'm recounting this, I recall looking around the room I'm in. Whenever I think or talk about this experience, I can vividly remember that terrifying sound and hear it in my head. Also, it just occurred to me that when you put the letter S at the beginning of the letter, it spells slaughter. Why did I think of that? The best way I can describe this laughter is for you to imagine a large group of kids singing "Row, row, row your boat." You know how one kid will start and seconds later another will join? And then hundreds of thousands of children laughing. As if one would start laughing and seconds later another would, and the pattern went on in an endless loop. I'm not saying the laughter sounded like the song "Row, row, row your boat." I'm saying they sounded in unison, like when the kids sing Row, Row, Row Your Boat together. One would start, then another later would start, and then another later, and the laughter was getting louder and closer. There was sinister laughing, goofy laughing, giggling, and all kinds of laughter coming from all around us. This couldn't be real. This sort of thing does not happen. What the hell was happening? I scream at Bob and his group that we need to get the hell out of there, but they were already running for the car, leaving their Wiccan book and candles behind. And without hesitation, I run after them and jump into the car just as the laughter is becoming deafening. We haul us out of there and drive about a mile up the road and pull over, as Bob is in no condition to drive and we're all freaking out. We all get out of the car pacing around it, asking each other if we had just really heard what we did. I tell Bob and that I'm so sorry because I had left the camera behind. He says he doesn't care and that he isn't going back for it. At this point I've got my hands on my knees, panting to try and catch my breath, as I have never in my life before been so terrified. That is when all of our chatter stops, as we once again heard the laughter off in the distance, very quietly at first, but slowly getting closer and closer and louder, until once again it's becoming deafening, and we jump back in the car and speed away. We drive about 6 miles, and for the first 3 we can still hear the laughter in the distance, with our windows down a little. We all begin to calm down by mile 4, when the laughter can no longer be heard, but we have no intention of pulling over, and Bob's friend is in the passenger seat with his phone, waiting for a signal to pop up. As he's about on mile 6, Bob's friend says he got 4 bars, and he hands the phone to Bob as he calls a friend of his who is into the occult and well versed an educator in it. And as we are driving, he describes what happened to the lady. Bob told me his friend told him that she believed in the children of the Hector or something like that. I have no idea about what the Hector is, but something like more of a guess to me. Anyway, as Bob is on the phone speeding out of the area, me and the other 2 people in the back seat all get a chill at the same time. And they told me later that it was just like me on the hair of the back of my neck standing on end, and a loud snapping noise coming from the front end of the car, and Bobby's celebrity stops dead in its tracks and will no longer move forward. He tries everything, but the car is not moving. We later discovered that the tie rod had snapped. Anyway, the friend Bob was talking about on the phone only lived about 20 minutes away from where we were, and said that they were on their way. As we sat in the car, nobody spoke after about 3 minutes, until we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road towards us. We knew it was too soon to be Bob's friend, but me and Bob thought maybe we could get a ride from a local, and we all unloaded out the car and stood in front of it, waiting for the vehicle to come fully to a stop. Now I cannot be certain, but my gut tells me that I am correct. But the vehicle doesn't stop, but as it comes into view, it's a beat-up old pickup truck, and it slows down as in the truck there are 2 men in their 30s to 40s, with huge beards, and they stare down at us and speed up after passing by. I look at Bob before we can speak, and he was already thinking, the guys from the boat. Before I can say anything back, and see headlights coming from the direction the truck just went. Bob called his friend back and told her to drive like hell and get there now, and hung up. 4 to 5 minutes go by and we see headlights coming. Relieved, we get all our stuff ready thinking it was Bob's friend. Then his phone rings. It was the lady who was coming to get us, telling Bob she took a wrong turn and would be at least another 10 to 15 minutes before she arrives. Bob hangs up the phone and watches in terror, as do I, because the same truck slowly passes again, this time with only one of the boatmen in the truck. This time though, the driver starts to crawl by and says, "Looks like you fellas could use some help," and then speeds up and drives off. This cemented the fact that Bob and I were definitely dealing with the boat guys. But where the hell was the other one? Why wasn't he in the passenger seat? And to make matters worse at this point, something we had almost completely forgotten about due to the boatmen was immediately reminded to us when we began to hear the laughter again in the distance, all around us like before over the next few minutes. It started to get closer and closer. I'm almost urinating in my pants at the sound as it's getting deafening and we have nowhere to run this time. And then from behind our car off in the distance, we see two sets of headlights coming on and two vehicles coming towards us slowly side by side, taking up the entire width of the backcountry dirt road coming our way. The laughter now seems to be coming from the woods on both sides of the road, and we're stuck. And now the laughter is zeroing in on us as if hundreds and thousands of children are within reaching distance of us. There's no wind, no sounds other than the crunch of the tires on the rocky dirt road and the two vehicles that are slowly approaching us. With our last shred of hope fading away into the laughter of the children and the headlights of the two vehicles surely being driven by the boatmen, we are given a reprieve, as at the time, coming from the other direction, we see another set of headlights coming fast as we hold our breath. The laughter, the boatmen, what could be next? How will we get out of this? And that is when the vehicle that was coming fast pulls up, and it's Bob's friend. She unlocks the car and rolls down her window and begins to tell us to get in. When this happens, the two sets of headlights coming from the other direction turn off, and Bob's friend says, "Oh my God, you weren't kidding about the laughing kid," she screams. We begin to tell her about the boat guys, and she turns the car around, and no sooner had she started to drive away did the two sets of headlights come on again, this time with their brights on, and they go about a car's length behind the car we're all crammed in. We yell to go, channeling my inner Jeff Goldblum, telling her much faster as she floors it for about a mile or two. But the vehicles stay on our tracks. For about the next 2 miles after that, we can all hear the laughter way off in the distance with our windows down. But after about 3 minutes, did it subside. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened, what the laughing children were, why they followed us, and if the boatmen were connected to this somehow, or if they were merely a coincidence of that day that were also there to terrify us. And why they did not react to the laughing children sound. Is the lantern connected to the laughing children, or did Bob and his group mistakenly call forth the laughing children through their ritual? Like I said, this happened years ago, but I still feel just as terrified now when I tell people about it or think about it. I've had constant chills and goosebumps as I've tried to share this. So, I'm a bit shaky. To all of you who think the paranormal is just a fun hobby to get your thrills with, I beg of you and warn you that we are not prepared for what is really out there. You think nothing will scare you or harm you, but you are dealing with unknown things. You have no idea how mundane or powerful the paranormal could be. If you use the paranormal as a thrill-seeking hobby, just use caution and always have your vehicle checked out beforehand. Oh, and watch out for seemingly psychopathic hillbillies and laughing children. I hope we never meet again.
This all went down during the spring break of my junior year of high school. My school was in a pretty small Iowa town, with a district spanning several smaller hamlets. During the summer of 2014, a few friends of mine put together a film club that would make short films and compete in national film festivals against other schools. We were a pretty small group and found it kind of difficult to get together for any actual filming until spring break of 2015, when we made plans for a little excursion. 4 of us ended up going on the trip, myself and 3 members of the club, Jake, Bill, and Kyle. We ended up choosing to go camping out at Mossy Glen Hollow, a supposedly haunted state park up in northeastern Iowa. Since the 1850s, there have been several murders and suicides out at Mossy Glen, including a few decapitations and a hired hitman in the 1930s. Being the edgy teens that we were, we jumped at the chance to go hiking and camping somewhere like that. It was within 15 minutes of a small town, so stocking up on food wouldn't be that big of an issue either. So, all lights green. We load up 2 of our sedans, programmed the GPS, and off we were for a spring break, camping in some haunted woods. After the first hour and a half on the road, a few red flags began to fly. After the last large town before getting way out in the boondocks, my phone's data signal cut out and the GPS randomly changed directions on us. Since none of us had any idea where the hell we were at, or where Mossy Glen was supposed to be, we didn't have much choice but to blindly follow the new route. Here's a little something about Iowa land distribution, especially up north, because the hills can get so uneven at places, you end up with portions of land that are too steep or too rocky to farm, or small flat basins that are surrounded by steep slopes that it makes farming incredibly difficult. Over the course of several decades, you end up with farms buying a plot of farmland with patches of unworkable land stuck in between. Rather than buy this land and pay property tax on it for several centuries, as these farms stay in the family for generations, the land either remains unpurchased and public, repurchased by the state, or donated to the state or DNR. Many of these plots get designated as state parks or preserves surrounded by private property, such as soon as we found out Mossy Glen Hollow. This explains the private property signs we saw by the lake, which was land purchased right next to the unusable boulder-covered creek. This is a bit important for the sake of the story, and now that you understand it, we will dive back in there. Once we're firmly in the middle of nowhere, our GPS took us off the paved highways and onto gravel roads. At this point, you typically would see the usual brown Iowa DNR signs, designating that you were near a state park. But there were none. There weren't even any tree clumps to indicate that you were near some sort of forest. Red flag number 2. Another 10 minutes or so into the drive, and the gravel road soon turns into a dirt road, then a low maintenance road, then a Class B minimum maintenance road, with Iowa's dedication to road preservation. This basically means that somebody probably came by and took a peek in the 90s, and promptly forgot about its existence. As we came around the last hilly bend that the GPS shows on our route, we see a farmhouse with a large machine shed with no lights or activity around either, and no cars in the driveway. A bit weirded out that a house would be right next to a state park, we slow down and keep rolling. To our dismay, however, the road dissolves into a mess of washed tractor tire gouges from last fall's harvest. We stop the cars as far down as we can pass without getting hung up on a frozen rut and unpack some of our equipment. The road gradually narrows, snakes down the middle of a field, and turns down into the small but very thick clump of woods at the bottom of a wide ravine. We get out and hike down the gradually steepening slope and take in the scenery. At first, everything looks like a pretty damn cool set to film at. There are several lime outcrops hanging off the hillside, a footpath with some picturesque tree overhang, and even a few birds out that made an unseasonal return from wintering down south. We can all hear some water running, but can't identify a source from the trail. Looking off in any direction, all that we see was a seemingly endless sea of trees. At the bottom of the hill was a small pond, in the middle of a grassy clearing with a fence. As we approached the fence, we noticed a sign: "Private property. Keep out." Bill checks his watch and realizes it's almost time for dinner. So we trek back to our vehicles and hook up the GPS. The nearest town over was a little place called Edgewood that had several diners and a gas station to load up on supplies for the week. We brought some canned food, but not much beyond that. As we got to town, we realized that Edgewood was a lot smaller than we had expected. Less than 900 people, it would turn out. Everyone knows everyone in these small towns, so we got several weird looks when 4 strangers rolled up with plates from the other side of the state. Kyle thought to ask the cashier and a few people at the gas station about Mossy Glen Hollow, and why the only route in was through some dude's field on a busted out dirt road. To our surprise, nobody had even heard of a place called Mossy Glen, nor could they figure out why the hell 4 high schoolers suddenly rolled into town looking for the place. Red flag number 3. We shrug it off as just a few crazy locals and take off back down the dirt trail. As we round the corner back near the farmhouse, we notice all the lights are off and nobody seems to be home. I suggest that we leave some sort of note on the house door that we're going to be parking on the side of the road near their place, just to be safe. It's starting to get late in the day, and being this far out in the country, it wouldn't be unheard of to come face to face with a shotgun when the homeowner finds our cars, since the road is impassable from that point onwards. Parking there wouldn't realistically block anyone off the road and would still technically be on public land. We hike back down the wooded trail and start scouting for a place to set up camp for the night, making sure to be on the public side of the fenced pond area. We discover that the sea of trees that we saw earlier was actually quite a bit thinner when seen from below. In fact, the dirt path led to a decently sized clearing with a creek and small waterfall cutting through the limestone deposits. None of us could believe that we had missed such a thing a few hours earlier. When Bill comes to a realization, he disappears around the corner, back into the trees, and emerges at the top of the trail a few minutes later. Though we could plainly see him, the trees lined up just right so that he could not see anything beyond the rocks below the path ledge. Continuing further up the creek, we noticed that there are conveniently placed rocks, about the perfect distance apart to step without disturbing the water or surrounding rocks. One could walk almost silently up and down the creek while the sound of the water masked the steps. Not thinking much of it, we take some pictures of the large moss-covered boulders and get some pretty nice scenic shots. We find a place to make camp, and everything is going great, until we approach the waterfall. Just before the waterfall sat a clearing without any large boulders or rocks, and an odd arrangement of logs. One sat horizontal, supported at each end by 2 piles of rocks. In front sat a crude stone circle with a pile of burnt logs inside. A fire pit with a bench. Though a bit of a surprise at first, we shrug it off as some weekend project that the people up at the house put together. After all, with such a cool place just a short walk from home, why not? I have a similar fire pit set up at home, so I'm not overly concerned. Hey, what the hell is this? Kyle yells it from a boulder a few yards ahead. On it sat a blaze orange beanie, a single gardening glove, and an empty can of beer. Oh, and a stick of deodorant that had seen some serious wear. Looking closer at the beer can, we realized that it must have been opened fairly recently. Foam is still fresh in the bottom of the can, and it had a fumy smell. Bewildered by what the hell we just found, Jake starts looking around the other side of the boulders upstream of the items. "Holy shit, there's a cave!" he shouts back to us. Later he told us the cave was large enough to comfortably fit a person inside, and that, more disturbingly, he saw some red fabric inside as well. Before he can get a good look around, Kyle calls the three of us back over, with a sense of urgency. He speaks very quietly to us and indicates that we shouldn't shout back. "Shampoo," he whispers, pointing urgently down at his feet. Sure enough, in the mud and leaves, there's a blue bottle of Suave shampoo right next to the creek. At this point, we're all adequately freaked out and ready to call our little soiree quits. Bill remains pretty sure that this is just junk left behind by the people at the house after a weekend and a few too many Bush lights. But things don't just add up to me. There's one detail that I've been leaving out at this point. The day before, this part of Iowa got some heavy rain, which contributed to the mud situation on the dirt road and on the trail. With the combination of wind and rain, the items on the rocks would have shown some signs of being wet, if not, then displaced entirely. Also, the air was pretty cold, as it is every year around this time, not getting above the mid-40s for the whole week. Then everything starts to click for me. Whoever drank the beer and left the shampoo, hat, glove, deodorant must have done this sometime this morning. The fire pit also had fresh char marks on the rocks, and the wood had not been wet for a while, meaning it must have been lit last night at the earliest. The small cave would have provided enough shelter from the rain to stay dry, without the freezing temperatures all through the day. Whoever was using shampoo out here must have had little other choice to do so. If it was the homeowners, they would have had to be seriously masochistic to bathe in the shallow, freezing rocky creek rather than at home. If it wasn't, then we likely weren't alone right now. Whoever left these things out left in a hurry, and if they were here 4 hours ago, they would have been able to see us on the trail cliff long before we even knew they were down here. Remembering the arrangements of rocks on the stream, they could have even been leaving their camp just as we were coming down the dirt trail. As I processed this, I started to look around at my surroundings and realized that the small area was bordered by the thick trees on the trail's side, several sets of huge boulders on the pond side, and limestone cliffs everywhere else. Due to the tree, rock, and hill cover, you could light a fire in the pit at night, and no one around you would even know. The illusion of being able to see up the dirt trail from the camp, but not down, played in reverse from the cliffs. If you were wearing brown or green, you could easily see down from the rocks on top of the camp below, while blending in with the trees above. Coming to these realizations, I noticed something else, something more sinister. The birds and small animals that were previously heard are now quiet, aside from the soft babble of the creek. The entire place is completely silent. As I start to explain this to the rest of the group, I see the wheels turning in their heads as well. Jake starts to head back to the small cave, when a rustling up on the limestone ridge catches our attention. Something large was shifting around up there, something that apparently didn't want Jake to see what was in the cave. We all look up at whatever or whoever made the noise as it started shuffling down the ridge towards the makeshift camp. Because of the high cliff, The only way down to us would be going all the way back down to the pond and then double back up the stream. Realizing this and almost crapping ourselves at how open we were, we book it back down the stream, up the dirt path across the field, and back to our cars. On the drive back to Edgewood, we all try and process what the hell just happened. I take a look at a satellite map, and the only really accessible way to the cliff where we heard the noise would be to walk up there from the pond. It was too craggy to approach from the adjacent field to the east. Whatever made that noise would have been large, and a deer getting up there wouldn't necessarily be out of the question, but I doubt it. It would have had to have been some incredible timing to have started moving around just as Jake began looking at the cave, and whatever red fabric was inside. Kyle found a report of an escaped convict from a local prison a few weeks ago, and was convinced that it was his camp that we found, though we were all doubtful at best of this idea. To satisfy his concerns, we'd agreed to report this strange thing we found to the police, anonymously, since we all really wanted to get home at this point. None of us followed up with them, and I doubt anything came of it. The small, close-knit town police department gets a report of strange sightings for some stranger the same day that 4 high schoolers roll up and park outside a farmer's house for a few hours and then book it out. Doesn't exactly spell high-threat criminal activity to me. Still, things still just don't seem to add up. Whoever came running down that cliff, if indeed it was a who, wanted to keep whatever was inside that cave hidden, but not enough to actually fight 4 decently tall and able teenagers. We figured he just wanted to scare us off, since the noises seemed to stop once we reached the dirt path. I thought it odd that someone living out in the woods with something seemingly to hide would set up shop in a state park. That is, until I checked my GPS again. That little reroute that it took us on was an old entrance to the park that had been cut off by the purchase of the lake area, sometime between the map records used for Google's navigation being updated and that day. The current entrance to the park is about 2 miles north of where the GPS sent us, thinking it was a faster route. The place we were at was still public land for sure, but not quite what we pictured. So dude in Mossy Glen Hollow, let's not meet again. About 11 years ago when I was 16, my family and friends went on an ATV trip to the North Woods in Wisconsin, somewhere in Iron Country. We went on yearly trips where we would ride all day but head back to the same camp at night. This particular trip was our first time in the area, so we found a good-looking campsite and made camp, then went riding. The trails in this area were not all too exciting, gravel logging roads that stretched miles with no one on them. So we cut the day short heading back to camp and deciding we would pack up camp and move next morning to a campground with better trails. Night came, and my dad and stepmom slept in a small cabin, while my 2 friends, stepbrother and I slept in a tent. It had been dark for a while, and we weren't getting any sleep, so we decided to take a walk around the campsite. The campground was almost at capacity, but no one was out at the fires, and it seemed like everyone was asleep. We walked the entire campground and were almost back to our tent, and we decided to stop and stare at the stars. We are from the Chicagoland area and have a lot of light pollution, so the stars that far north are very impressive. As we sat there pointing at the stars and constellations with our low-quality flashlights, I noticed a satellite slowly moving across the sky. It was moving in a straight path across the sky, and I pointed it out and followed it with a flashlight until everyone saw it. It reached the center of the sky with its path, when suddenly a large white light illuminated myself and the other three. We stood there, staring up at the sky in awe of what was happening. I don't remember any of us talking or questioning the light, and I also can't tell you exactly how much time passed underneath it. When the light stopped shining, all our eyes were still facing the sky, and we saw the same satellite dart across the sky in the same path. Stress on the word dart, as the object moved about 10 times faster than before when I first noticed it. All four of us looked at each other shocked at what had just happened, and I immediately went back to camp. We talked about what it could have been, and what could have happened, but never came to any conclusion other than it being a UFO. The next day we told my parents about the encounter and moved to a new campsite, and business as usual. For a few years I completely forgot about the event, which is strange in its own sense. However, to this day, all four of us remember the strange encounter with the bright light. After a heavy night of drinking and camping, we woke up and nobody wanted to make breakfast, so we decided to drive into town and find dinner. We're approaching where the dirt meets the pavement, and come up on a dozen sheriffs blocking the road, 2 of which have rifles pointed on us. We stop the truck about 40 feet from them, and hear them yell over the bullhorn to stick our hands out the windows. They then instruct us to approach on foot, with hands in the air. They search my truck and find it loaded with loads of guns and beer. That's when they tell us that a Forest Service agent has been shot nearby and passed. They eventually let us go, but telling us our camping gear is forfeit until the guy is caught. We didn't want to leave our gear and go home, so we end up at a near casino and continued the party there. A few hours later, someone in the casino says that there are loads of cops outside. We go out and there must have been at least 100 sheriffs, local PDs, and every branch of law enforcement. Apparently the murderer had stopped at the casino gas station and an officer recognized him. The law enforcement officer drew his gun, the murderer went for his, and the murderer shot him dead. We went back to camp and then home the next day. I checked the newspaper article. They had a map of where the murder happened. It was a 1/4 mile down the road from our campsite. A few fraternity brothers and I were backpacking in Nantahala National Forest and met some guys, local guys, and I mean not local hangout bros, but local backwoods, lived there for generations, hate the federal government and society kind of people. Guys that had apparently been helping Eric Rudolph, the Olympic bomber, hide in the national forest by supplying him with food drops. Really weird drunken campfire conversations. They took us to one of their hideout/drop-off caves. They were too serious, and the whole reason they trusted us was because some things were said drunkenly to make them think that we were of a similar mindset to him and their worldviews. We parted ways and spent a few days trying to figure out if it was all rubbish. That same week, they catch Eric Rudolph in the dumpster of a Piggly Wiggly 3 miles away from where we met the guys, and 4 miles from the cave that they would drop stuff off for him. Every single thing these guys said matched up with every single news story that was on the news. We even gave them a bottle of Jack, which they said they'd give to Eric. Creepy as hell. The drunken conversations I had with these 2 guys at 3 a.m. sitting in the middle of nowhere are hauntingly creepy in retrospective. I have gone on a yearly spring turkey hunting trip for the past 7 years. I couldn't go this past year due to joining the military. Around my 3rd year in, my dad and I left to go fishing one day, leaving my dad's best friend and his father-in-law back at camp. When we returned, there was another fellow back at camp, Not really all that uncommon, as we camp right along the Appalachian Trail. Well, we got back there and figured that they had made a friend. I sat at the campfire with the guy and the father-in-law, while my dad and his best friend go get firewood. Now we're a really friendly group, and this guy wants to make camp. We politely say no, and that there isn't any room at our spot. He leaves and goes to make camp right down the road, where there are more spots. When my dad and his best friend get back, they load up all the guns and call the state troopers. I get handed a gun, and I'm told to be wary. I'm not sure what's going on. I just comply until I'm told the story. Turns out the guy was wanted for murder, self-admitted, who had hiked the trail all the way up to New England with virtually no gear. When asked if he was carrying a weapon, he trailed off and didn't give a full answer. When I was out fishing, the guy said he needed to change and dropped tow in front of the two of us that stayed behind. That was the first time in the 25+ years the trip had been going on that any of the guns were loaded at the campsite. My boyfriend and I went backpacking in the mountains. I'd been camping before, but only car camping, and didn't have to carry my bag for long, if at all. So this was my first time actually backpacking. After getting lost, trying to find a parking lot that the map swore was there but wasn't actually there, we drove around the mountain and finally found a parking lot at the top. We'd planned to walk down the mountain, camp, and then walk back up the following day. About an hour in, it's maybe 6 p.m, and we come across this guy sitting off to the side of the trail, cooking in a cheap gas stove. He asks if we know where we're at, and if we can point him in the direction of a certain place on the mountain, and says he was parked there. He continues talking about how he had a friend drop him off, who was going to pick him up at point A, and then changed the story to he was parked at point B, and said the friend who dropped him off went to hike somewhere else, and another friend who had the map turned back to point C to wait in the car. We finally bid this dude good luck and continue down the trail. The trail is poorly marked and doesn't correspond with the map we found online. We couldn't get an actual map because the park office was closed due to asbestos. So we're really confused when we come to a horse trail with no markings to tell us if we're still on the right path. We decided to go down the trail and see if we can find a place to camp for the night and find our way out in the morning. Both sides of the trail are lined with barbed wire, preventing us from being able to camp there. Eventually, we run into a huge puddle in the middle of the trail, and we decide to turn back and go back to part of the trail before it turns into a horse trail. That way, we can camp there for the night, because it was really dark and we were tired. About 20 feet behind us was the man from earlier. He talked to us again, and throughout the conversation we learned he had heavy narcotics, including fentanyl, and another one I don't remember the name of. By this time, there are so many red flags, changing stories, following us, fentanyl. So we took off and decided to go back to the car and just drive home. We live about 4 hours away, and we're about 6 miles from the car. So we take off up the trail as fast as we could. I got severely dehydrated on the way and was struggling. We had plenty of water, but it was very hot and were practically running up the mountain. Eventually I started hallucinating, thinking I was vomiting blood, but it was just red Gatorade, or that there was some blood coming from my shoes, sweat. And there may or may not have been a bear somewhere nearby, but that could have been a hallucination too. We ended up doing the full 6 miles up the mountain in 2 hours. We reached the parking lot, and that's when I gave up. I decided to wait on a bench while my boyfriend got the car. The parking lot was curved, so we were out of sight with each other. He finally came back down to me with the car, and helped me in. We found a gas station to sleep at for a little while before heading back home. Oh, and as we were driving out of the parking lot, we saw a sign saying hitchhikers may be escaped convicts. Perfect. I went camping with a group of friends on some public land that I knew quite well. I spent a lot of time out there trail riding and camping most weekends for about 3 years. We set up camp at a spot we had used a few times and had partied with other people at this spot on a number of occasions. On this trip, there were 6 of us, and 4 of my friends decided to go to a party that we found out about while on the trails earlier that day. I was tired from digging my Jeep out of a sand washout that I had no business driving into, but it looked pretty cool for about 2 minutes until I got stuck. Anyway, my friend's girlfriend decided to stay at camp with me when everyone else left for the party. We watched the fire die down and listened to the animals. I got a kick out of her being afraid of the coyotes making noise on the other side of the swamp. I assured her it was fine and they wouldn't bother us. After a bit, we get into our sleeping bags. As I'm starting to doze off, she asks if I heard that. I ignore her and try to fall asleep. A minute or 2 later, she sits up and asks again. I respond, "Nope, go to sleep." Then, not even a minute later, I hear what sounds like an ice cream truck on the trail we're on. This trail is one way in and out, about 3 miles long, and ends in a clearing. And we were camped within a 1/4 of a mile of the entrance/exit. We also went to the end of the trail after we ate dinner, and there wasn't anyone on it then. No one drove past either. I did not hear any engine noise, only the creepy ass music. Not to mention the trail was a rutty mess, so even a vehicle with a reasonably quiet exhaust would be revving high enough to be heard through the woods. I didn't tell her this because I didn't want to scare her more, but it scared the crap out of me. So when she asked if I had heard it that time, we got into the Jeep and went to the party, and I slept on a raggedy couch next to the bonfire in a sand pit. In the year 2000, when I was 10 years old, my parents sent me to a 5-day summer camp in Huntsville, Ontario. This camp was definitely a Bible camp, and being raised without religion, I felt uncomfortable there. But I got along well with my peers. Me and 7 other girls were staying in the room on the far right, and there were 3 other rooms on the main floor, and upstairs is where the camp counselors bunked. The main floor had a very high ceiling, and near the top was a small square door which attached to where the camp counselors were staying. I was staying along the right wall on the bottom bunk. On the 3rd night, me and my bunkmate were having a blast, just talking and telling jokes. But our camp counselor opened the little door at the top of the room and told us to be quiet, so we all went to bed. Out of nowhere I hear Brianna yelling, "Cat, wake up now!" And being the light sleeper I was, I immediately woke up. I didn't know how long I had slept for. I then heard Angel say, "Cat, look over to the bunk in front of you." I was facing the wall, so I turn around and am met with a black figure with long curly hair sitting on the ladder leading up to the top bunk on the bed in front of mine. The moonlight illuminated the entire room, and this figure was completely opaque, shaking her long curly hair. I looked around the room and noticed all of the girls were all accounted for and definitely awake. I stared at this thing for what seemed like an eternity. Every one of the girls were in complete hysterics and crying, but I was dead silent. I couldn't make a peep. I was completely terrified to the point I couldn't blink or even move. I mean, what could I have done? This thing was sitting there right before my eyes. Then this figure stands up and jumps off the ladder and just stood at the edge of the bed for a moment. All of the girls scream, "Cat, get out of there now!" To which the figure moved around in an almost robotic way and started walking towards me. I finally then find the nerve to book it out of the bottom bunk and run to the other side of the room. I run up to Brianna and Angel's bunk and climb the ladder as quickly as I could. At this point, I started becoming hysterical and crying like the rest of them. The figure was still standing near my bed. Angel and I started hugging, and I was too afraid to even open my eyes after what I'd seen. Angel decides to jump down off the bunk, switch the light on, and just like that, the figure was gone. I guess we made a lot of noise, and the camp counselor opened the little door and told us to keep it down. We told her what we'd seen, and she came downstairs to investigate. She came into the room and told us, "There's nothing here. Your mind was probably playing tricks on you. Now back to bed." All of the girls, including myself, were still pretty upset and scared, and just sat up in our bunks talking about what we'd seen. 5 minutes after, we hear screaming coming from the room directly across the hall from us. We all started crying again, and the camp counselors opened the little door and told us, "See what you've started? You have everyone in the cabin scared." The camp counselor went to investigate, and we turned on the lights in our room and opened the door. We hear one of the girls in the room across from us say while crying, "Something lifted our bunk. Please don't make us stay in there. It's going to kill us." To which the counselor sternly responded with, "That's impossible. Now quiet down and go to bed. This is the final time I'll say this." After 20 minutes of talking quietly, we all went to bed. Nothing else strange happened during the duration of the camp trip, and I had exchanged phone numbers with the girls. About a week after the camp trip had ended, I contacted both Angel and Brianna and asked them if they remembered that night, and they both said they did, and they said they'd never forget it. This was the very first experience I had with the paranormal. After the Bible camp incident, I had no more paranormal events. Until I was 14, that is. When these occurrences started, I would mostly just hear strange stuff, like someone scratching the walls outside my bedroom, screaming and growling, and footsteps, and sometimes what sounded like footsteps with long toenails dragging along the floor. Very creepy laughs that sounded like it came from someone with an incredibly deep voice, and occasionally something whispering my name into my ear. These noises used to be confined to outside my bedroom, but after a while, they'd always lead into my room. Very rarely would I ever see anything. It was mostly just audio. When I did see something, it was mainly a tall black hooded figure, either standing in my doorway or the foot of my bed. Sometimes I would feel something trying to grab my foot, or something running its fingers through my hair, which caused me to always keep the end of my blanket tucked under my feet for years. These occurrences would generally last all night until sunrise, but its peak hours were between 1 and 4 a.m. Sometimes things would occur even during the day. At age 14 one night, I was awoken by shuffling and noise coming from my dresser area. I'm a light sleeper. Any noise will wake me. And when I looked at my dresser, I saw a very tall hooded man, pitch black, going through my panty drawer. Even though I was completely terrified, I got the nerve to sit up in bed. The figure then turned completely around and acknowledged me in the room by staring at me for a few seconds before vanishing. For some reason I had no idea why, but I fell asleep after that with no problem at all. When I awoke in the morning, one of my pairs of bras were missing, as well as some of my underwear on the floor. Fast forward a few weeks, I was downstairs in the basement doing laundry and saw something hanging from a rusty nail on a support beam. And sure enough, it had been the bra that was missing. My mum's best friend Denise was over a few days ago to go blueberry picking with my mother during the summer. Denise brought with her about 20 packages of cosmetic removal wipes, which we put on the top of the towel cupboard outside the bathroom door. My mum decided she'd go grocery shopping with my dad to get food for supper, which left Denise and I in the house alone. Knowing that Denise was also sensitive to the paranormal, I began telling her about what had been happening in the house and what I had experienced. We decided to get up off the couch and walk towards my kitchen, and then we see our locked front door unlock itself and open without any force. Wide-eyed, we both look at each other. "Did you see that?" she said. I then walked to lock the front door. This incident got Denise pretty shaken up, and later on in the night I was lying in bed and started to hear a crinkly sound. The crinkly noise continued for a few minutes, and it dawned on me that it was someone playing with the packages of makeup removal wipes on the top of the cupboard. All of a sudden, they all fall down onto the floor. My mum opens her bedroom door and goes to pick them up because she heard them fall too. It got eerily quiet for about 20 minutes, and then the crinkly sounds start again. All the wipes fell down, and not 5 seconds later, my bed was pushed into the wall really hard with me on it, causing me to scream bloody murder. My mother came running out of her room asking me what was wrong. I was crying and told her what happened, and she told me it was nonsense. I got out of bed, turned on the light, and pushed my bed away from the wall, when I noticed the wall was indented on the right side where the impact hit. I never push my bed right up against the wall. I always have my bed at least an inch away from the wall, because my power outlet is on the left side of my bed. I swear, these are all true. It was the end of my freshman year of college, so my friend and I spent a weekend at my family's cabin by ourselves to celebrate. The weekend was fairly uneventful. The most exciting things that happened involved burning a pizza on the grill and a chipmunk trying to join me while I was using the outhouse. But then, we had to leave. Even though I had gone to the cabin every summer since I was born, I didn't really know how to get to and from it. We had been using my friend's dad's GPS. It was pretty old, and probably hadn't been updated in a while, which is likely why it took us where it did. The route we took was unfamiliar to me, but what did I know? It was a GPS. I trusted it enough to bring us where we needed to go. It took us down a twisted side road that I knew was wrong, but I kept on going, thinking that maybe it was going through the woods and that it would be faster. That's when it told me to take a left. I obeyed, but was extremely confused because it looked like a dirt road. I slowed down and looked at the GPS when my friend let out a horrified, "Oh my God." I looked up and realized we weren't on the road at all. We were in someone's driveway. Then I saw the dolls. They were worn by the weather, full of dirt, and faded from the sun. The ones I took note of were the clowns and bodiless heads. There were so many, I wasn't able to take all of them in, and every single doll was hanging from a tree. My friend and I were both shrieking at this point, her yelling at me to get back up and get out of there, and me yelling, "What the hell," over and over. We safely got back to the main road, and followed that until the GPS gave us a different route, which took us home without further incident. Although I didn't see the person living in that rundown house, it was one of the most terrifying things that has happened to me. It didn't even feel real while it was happening. I felt like I had been dropped in the middle of a horror movie about a serial killer with a doll fetish. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the person living there had been there when we pulled up into their house, but I try not to let my imagination get the best of me. I do sincerely hope we never meet that person. Let me preface this by saying I am one of the most skeptical people you'll ever meet. I'm not religious, I don't believe in ghosts or aliens, although I do believe that there might be life out there in the vastness of space, or any of that. This is the weirdest thing I've ever encountered, and have no real logical explanation for. No drugs, no booze, or anything like that were involved. My friends and I went camping up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire most summers in the middle of high school, and a few years after until life happened and we went our separate ways. Now, being a bunch of unorganized teen boys/man children, we always took forever to get in gear and actually get going, usually not leaving southern Massachusetts where we lived until late afternoon/early evening. One year we got up there at about 10 p.m. or so, and decided rather than hike into the woods, we would just sort of camp/crash out in the parking lot and hike in the morning. After a bit of unwinding and some food, everyone went to bed, except for me and one other dude. We ended up wandering over a small wooden footbridge over a river, and it was a perfectly clear night filled with stars and a fairly bright moon. And as we were shooting the breeze for a couple of hours about all sorts of stuff, movies, games, life and the like, it had to be well past midnight by this point. So as we were chatting, we both got this creepy feeling of something being there, and it was sinister. Looking at the far end of the bridge, there was this massive dead tree. No leaves, just clawing branches, silhouetted against the sky. We both were like, man, I swear that tree is creeping us out. But that's just silly, right? At first, we tried to dismiss it as silly, but both of us kept feeling more and more unnerved, until finally I was like, screw this, I'm a grown man. I'm not afraid of a damn tree. I'ma walk over there. I get to about 2/3 of the way, and it feels like something reached in and grabbed my pounding heart, and I went ice cold. I backed up and was like, yeah, I'm afraid of a tree. I seriously think I'm not coming back if I go over there. We retreated from the bridge and decided to go back to bed into the sleeping bags by the car. Next morning after breakfast, we decided to hike into the trail by going across that bridge. Halfway across, my friend freezes. Dude? I look across the bridge. It's a clearing. There are no trees there. I was winter camping in northern Wisconsin with a few buddies when at around 11 p.m., a guy appears in the firelight out of nowhere with no flashlight or headlamp. Now, this place is not a campground, nor a national forest, or any land designated for camping, just wilderness. The nearest town is approximately 12 miles away, and the roads aren't plowed, so they're nearly impassable this time of year unless you have the right equipment. This guy sits down, has a couple of beers, is friendly, and leaves after about 45 minutes and disappears back into the forest. We have been camping and exploring this area for about a decade, and from the direction he came from, there is only forest that empties into vast swamps. I don't know how or where he was going or surviving that night, because it was midnight, and we never saw or heard a truck leave on the only road in and out of this area. There are no cabins back here, no camps, nothing. It was February in northern Wisconsin, and the low that night was around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. My old man was an avid outdoorsman in the Colorado Rockies in the late 80s. He'd go on week-long treks with his buddies. One summer, they'd been out for a few days in Pikes National Forest. They set up camp in a ravine they thought was safe. That night, my dad unzipped the tent to take a leak in the dark, and outside stood a pair of pale bare feet. My dad screamed and unzipped the tent. Everyone else woke up and asked what was wrong. My dad said someone was barefoot out there. They went out and flashed their lights for a bit, hollering. My dad swore he saw what he saw and described the feet in detail. They were old, blotchy feet. One even had a lump on the ankle. Tony, his buddy, asked which foot, left or right, and my dad said it was the right. Then Tony said they needed to move their camp immediately. Dad asked why. Tony said they didn't have time. They went along and packed up and moved it to the top of the hill. The next morning they woke up to find a flash flood had torn through the ravine during the night. It would have surely killed them. Tony's grandfather had died a month prior, and one of the last things he said to him was that he would always watch over him. The feet my dad described reminded Tony of his grandfather's very feet. My dad is highly religious, supernatural or not. Someone's vision of paranoia saved their lives that night. I was out camping on a shoreline in Alaska for field work. It was getting dark, and I started falling asleep, with my bear spray next to me. In the middle of the night, I hear a deep, angry grunting sound. I immediately grabbed my bear spray and started yelling, "Hey, bear!" The noise doesn't stop for a solid 2 minutes, and I'm literally thinking it's the end. But then I hear a large splash. I never want to hear another sea lion growl in the middle of the night again. A few years ago, I went camping with my dad, about a quarter mile off the trail. As we were cooking food, a bear baby wanders into our small clearing. We were a bit freaked out, but it was probably more scared of us, so it wandered away. We left the campsite to hike a bit, and when it started to get dark, we traveled back to our campsite. We realized we hadn't marked it in any way, and spent a while looking for it. We heard some growling, really loud, and freaked. We started to walk on the trail back to the car, with my dad holding onto our only flashlight. We heard a growl closer this time. Not super close, but close enough that we started to run. By then it was pitch black other than the flashlight. As I ran, I heard my dad drop the flashlight. He found it, but only one of the batteries was still in it. I was thinking this definitely felt like a basic horror plot. We ran pretty fast the few miles back to the car and drove home. We came back the next day and searched all day. Couldn't find it. We came back the next weekend. Still couldn't find it. And the next weekend, my dad went by himself and found it. He brought the stuff home. The tent had claw marks through it, and all the food that we hadn't yet hung in a tree was eaten. I have not been camping since. When I was younger, probably between 10 and 11, I went camping with my family. I'll just get right to it. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning, and I couldn't really sleep. The tent me and my brother were in was really hot and very uncomfortable. Anyway, while I was trying to go to bed, I heard a very faint whimper. I tried to ignore it, because I figured I was just tired. Our campsite was along a road with many other camps nearby. The whimpers started to get louder, and then turned into crying. I heard footsteps outside of our tent, and a girl crying her eyes out. Now let me tell you, it didn't go faint, it got louder and louder. It remained in the same spot the entire time. That's so important, because it indicates that she was looking at our tent site, crying. It then gets worse. Then it turned into a full-on scream for a few seconds, then cuts out. When she started screaming, my brother woke up. We both look at each other and just get all the pillows and stuff our heads under them. We couldn't sleep at all that night. I'm glad we left next morning. A few years back, a friend and I used to camp out in the woods near my house. You weren't technically supposed to camp there, but it's not like anyone would notice if we did. Anyway, we set up camp, had a few drinks, and eventually went into the tent around 1 to 2 a.m. My friends fell asleep pretty much instantly, but I couldn't get comfortable because there was a rock or something under the tent where I was sleeping. It's a 2-man tent, so there wasn't a whole lot of room to move around or anything. After about half an hour, I saw a faint light from the distance shining into the tent that slowly got closer. I don't know why I didn't wake my friend up right away, and after the light got about 5 meters from the tent, it began circling once or twice, at which point I was trying my best to quieten my breathing and was nudging my friend to try and get him up. After what felt like forever, my friend finally woke up. I pointed to the light source, and we ended up running out of the tent, shouting, and waving the axe that we had used to collect wood for the fire. At which point, the person seemed to leg it, because we never found any trace of him again afterwards. We called up my parents, and got them to drive up to us and take us back home. Bear in mind, we were 17 to 18 at the time. About a week later, my mother found out from one of her dog walking buddies that there was a man in his late 20s that routinely snuck into farms around our area and took pieces of farm equipment, so I could only assume that he was looking around our camp for things to take. Almost 4 to 5 months after that, a homeless man was arrested for murdering his friend in a town close to where I live. Apparently, he used to sleep in and around the woods that we were camping in. The moral of this story is not to go camping where you don't belong. Go find an actual campsite where there are people who will protect you from this sort of thing. It's better to pay $20 for a safe place to camp than risk any confrontation later down the line.
One of my friends always has these get-rich-quick schemes or shady ways of making money on the side. In one of his more brilliant moves, he decides he's going to rent a house out near the country line to host illegal poker games. Anyway, this property is probably 4 or 5 acres with a tiny rundown church about 1,000 yards away on one side, and a redneck guy living in a trailer probably a quarter of a mile or so on the other side. However, the property backs up to the woods, and since it's always cheaper than the range, I and a third friend ask our renter friend if we can go shoot some guns on the property. He obliges us, and we head out there on a Saturday afternoon and find a nice barn at the tree line to go shoot into. Now we're just shooting paper targets with pistols, so we're not that far back and don't need that much room to do it. After a few magazines, we decide to venture into the woods to see how far back the property goes. We get down to the bottom of the hill and see the fluorescent ribbons that the surveyors tied to the trees to mark the property line. We realized the property is bigger than we thought, because we're about 150 to 200 yards in the woods at this point. Just as we were remarking about how big it is, we see a dead animal about 10 yards away across the property line. Walking up to examine it, we see it's a goat that's had its head cut off. Like, cleanly done by a human cut off. Then we see a severed goat head a little further away. The creepy part is it's not the same goat. The fur is different and cut differently. Imagine one head cut off a chin, and then another cut off at the shoulders. Well, we didn't stick around to see if there was a goat neck anywhere, because we realized that it wasn't decayed very much, and must have been done in the last day or two. Now, if we weren't armed, it would have been a lot scarier, but it was still creepy because I fear humans more than anything you can get out in the woods. Now, I say this was out there in the country, but it was in South Carolina, so there's not really a crazy expanse of wilderness being an East Coast state. That's pretty much all settled by people. The thing that gets me is that there was a serial killer they caught there not too long ago. This incident happened 10 years back, so perhaps he was killing animals first.
While my brother and I were camping at this primitive campsite in West Texas, it was about 12:30 at night, and we start hearing this very faint opera music in the forest around us. After heating up SpaghettiOs on our fire, which the park ranger specifically told us not to make, we'd noped the hell out of there and hiked the 6 miles back by moonlight to our truck and drove home. It was like it was following us, because we heard it all the way about a mile away from the parking lot. The reason it was creepy was because when we got to our campsite, after getting lost and escorted by the same park ranger from earlier in the story, he told us we were lucky to be the only people for miles around because of how peaceful it was. He said there was no one else there. We were out in a state park, tent camping, not far from civilization. There were 3 of us. After drinking a bit too much and some other partying, we hiked a bit up the mountain behind our camp. Stupid. It was pitch black with a very steep incline. About 30 minutes into the hike, in the middle of nowhere, we see a structure. It's a door and not much else. The door is built into a brick building. It had 4 walls, but the structure was so small and built just for the door. The front was about 6 feet wide, and then from the front to the back, it was probably 2 feet. I know it doesn't sound that creepy, but when you find a closed door on a tiny brick building thrown into the party, it becomes really creepy. Turns out the door was unlocked, so we opened it and there's no floor inside, but a ladder going down. You bet your ass none of us had the balls to go down. We dropped some rocks, and it took quite a while to hit the bottom. No splash, just a solid smack of rock against concrete. There wasn't much else we could do. Shit was really strange. I have no recollection of where it was, and I don't ever want to go back.
While I was growing up, my family would visit the same lake every year for a week every summer. As we got older, we would visit a large rock called the Cliffs and jump off. The rock was only 15 feet tall at the highest point, but the water was really deep. When we got older, we would jump in and try to touch the bottom, but we never could. When my brother and I were in our teens, we took kayaks out to the cliffs to jump on our own. We jumped off several times, and when we got too cold, we took a break on the top of the cliffs to warm up in the sun. As we were sitting there, we noticed a white shape in the water, floating towards the surface. It was a letter, H. Eventually it sank back into the water and we lost sight of it. Before we could look away or say anything, another shape floats up. It was the letter E. Eventually it too sank below, but it was soon followed by two more letters, L and P. We didn't jump in after that. We stood up and left without saying a word. We never mentioned it to anyone, and I forgot it had even happened for a while. Several years ago I was working at a camp counselor, and I told this story as a ghost story. I'd forgotten about it, and I texted my brother to see if I hadn't just made it up completely. I asked him if he remembered the time we went jumping off cliffs alone and saw something in the water. He replied yes, that he remembered. I asked him what it was, and his reply was the letters spelled help.
Back in the 80s, I was a camper at this place in the Adirondacks, a 6 million acre state park in upstate New York. All camps have their own customs, and I'm not sure if this occurred elsewhere, but I was sitting around a campfire and the smoke was blowing in my face. We would utter the phrase, "I hate white rabbits," and I swear this worked. The smoke would immediately move towards another direction. No, it was not the breathiness of speaking the words that made the smoke move. It was rumored to be a voodoo chant. So things were different back in the 80s. The things we did back then might have gotten you kicked out of camp if you were caught these days. Or maybe it would result in a lawsuit in jail time. Like the time my counselor locked me in his room with a 6-pack of Budweiser tall boys and told me that I couldn't come out until I was finished. But that's a separate story. This camp was right on a very large and pristine lake, and periodically there would be hikes and canoe trips to some of the islands on the lake. You got to choose your adventure. So we were on this canoe hike to a large, really large, island that was not too far from camp. We were all the slackers, smokers, and stoners on this hike. My kind of peeps. The island was so large. It had a pretty wide running trail that went around the perimeter of the island. Wide enough to comfortably ride around a 4-wheeler. And they were wider than I was at the time. So I mentioned this was the 80s, right? That first night some of us campers were partying with the counselor. Beers were being drunk, and someone had some mushrooms that I did not partake in. We, of course, were sitting around the fire. When the smoke blew in someone's face, they said the phrase, "I hate white rabbits." The smoke moved. The next recipient of the smoke said the words, and the smoke moved again. The words began to be uttered more quickly as the smoke moved faster and faster from person to person. At the height of this frenzied chanting, the smoke was starting to almost look like a vortex. The next morning, I opened our tent to see lying on the ground, spanning the width of the running trail, the biggest rabbit I've ever seen in my life to date. It was dead. It had eyes that were glazed over and blue, and it was white. I live on a small 5-acre hobby farm, nestled amongst a bunch of other 5-ish-acre farms and homesteads. Not the suburbs, but not exactly deep woods either. Last year, some asshole in a pickup truck pulled over on the road beside my house and started shooting into the forested area of my property. I was just sitting at the kitchen table when I heard a huge gunshot. I thought it might have been a backfire, but then it happened again. I ran outside and could just see the guy through our hedge. He had a very big rifle and was pointing at it, shooting at my goats. One of my goats is slim and brown and looks a bit like a deer. But dude, There are houses and people all over the place. Part of me wanted to march over and rip him a new one, but the other part of me told me I didn't want to become tragic headlines, so I just snuck closer to get a better look. But he got back into his truck and drove away. Turns out, one of my neighbors was outside at the time. He ducked behind a tree to avoid being shot. We called the cops, but we never managed to get his license plate number. I grew up in Philadelphia, with a wooded creek behind our roadblock. My brother and I were always forbidden to play anywhere near there, and not even think about going there. So as any good little child does, one boring summer day, we smelled smoke and heard noises, and decided we were the best detectives to snoop it out. After minutes of walking further into the thicker brush, we finally saw the source of smoke, as we saw two men walking away from a burning car fire. It wasn't until a few years later after dinner, overhearing the adults talk about that poor unidentified little girl's remains found in a burnt skeleton of a car years ago in the woods, my brother and I, then 12 and 14, looked at each other wide-eyed, jaws dropped, as we put two and two together to realize what we had stumbled upon in the woods that day. And if we had been older or smarter, or unafraid of getting whooped by going down there in the first place, the murderers could have been caught. And even maybe, that little girl could have been saved. But looking back at it, I realized more than likely she was already deceased, before the fire, and that we're lucky to have made it out ourselves. I was camping at a popular campground in the mountains with my boyfriend, but it was November, and it was their last open weekend, so no one was there. We were chatting and having a good time around the campfire and drinking. My boyfriend has to go pee, so he walked to the other side of the road and peed in the bushes. While over there, he very slowly and quietly got my attention and pointed out the large glowing eyes staring back at him from the bushes. He still has his wiener out while in the stare-off with the mountain lion. We very carefully backed up and stayed really close to the fire until we went to bed in the car instead of the tent. We could hear it walking around after. The worst part was, I went to find the pit toilet 15 minutes before this happened, by myself. I even got slightly lost while trying to find it, and was probably being stalked by the cougar. I've been pretty nervous camping ever since. I was leading a backpacking trip for a Girl Scout camp. There were two other adults, the counselor in the kids group who was supposed to care for the kids as I taught wilderness skills. Our first day out, we arrived and chose where to camp. I told the kids and staff to set up their tents. I set mine up quickly and then told the other two adults that I was going off to poop. I walked a ways away from the kids, dug my hole, and was doing my business when gunshots fired. I wasn't finished though, so although I knew the kids would be spooked, I trusted the counselors were doing their job and taking care of them. I finished, left no trace, and hiked back to the camp where the kids set up. I arrived about 5 minutes after the gunshots. There was pandemonium. The girls were panicking. One had apparently taken the lead and suggested that everyone change into camouflage colors. A few had changed, the others asked me what to do. What I couldn't understand was where the hell the other staff were. I calmed the kids, explained to them that there were often hunters in the area and that they weren't madmen out to get them. I told them that if they really wanted to change, bright clothing was actually best, but they were fine. I then asked where the other adults were. They just shrugged. I found the other two counselors in their tent, which they had pitched far from the kids. They were relaxing, reading magazines they'd apparently packed for entertainment, and giving each other quizzes. I was frankly shocked and appalled. I lost my temper and yelled and asked them why they hadn't gone and checked on the kids when they heard gunshots. They shrugged. "We assumed you were taking care of it." "But I told you I was leaving to crap in the woods. You two were responsible for the kids when I was gone." "We thought you'd come back. We're taking a break." So I dealt with the kids, counselors included. I met the hunters while refilling water and let them know to avoid hunting in the area where we're camping. When we got back to camp, my supervisor got a full report, and those two staff members were never given a backpacking group again or placed together. The kids, luckily, had a good time on the rest of the trip. When I was 8, I went camping with my mom, stepdad, and my little brother. We were all in the same tent. I remember getting up in the middle of the night to go to pee, and when I was walking back to the tent from the tree line, I heard, "Mike? Mike? Do you want to go for a walk in the woods?" It sounded exactly like my mum's voice, whispering, and I could see the silhouette of whoever it was whispering, and it looked like my mum, but I knew it wasn't her because I'd just left the tent, where she was sleeping. I remember my heart pounding like I knew it wasn't my mum, and it was something sinister. But I responded and said, "Yeah, 1 minute, let me just grab my coat," because I didn't want to upset her or it or whatever it was. "Hurry up then," the voice responded. I got into the tent and woke everyone up in a crazy panic. My mum and stepdad told me I must have been sleepwalking, but I swear I remember it so vividly, and I don't sleepwalk and never have. At the time, I knew in my head it was real. I'm terrified of the woods now. This is actually true, and I try and tell my mum every time now and then that I actually saw and heard what I said, but she perpetually dismisses it. If I'm honest, I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I don't know what that was. This happened in the woods and changed my view of the world as a teenager. Up the street from my childhood house was a couple trailers. I had a four-wheeler and would ride up the trails all day. One day I'm riding and I get this random horrible feeling. So I stop and get off at the ATV and start walking up the trail. Well, some arsehat puts a piece of fishing line across the trail that would easily take my head off. I'm guessing that the feeling I had in the pit of my chest was that I was being watched, or that I subconsciously noticed the fishing line. I have no idea why I stopped that day, and it baffled me ever since, but it has honestly changed my life. I grew up in Alaska, just on the bubble of civilization. There, even in the big cities, you'll get bear and moose and such. I was walking home from the bus stop. Our driveway was about a half-mile long through woods. I heard noises to my right and stopped, hoping it was anything but the one animal that scares me. And then it stepped out of the trees. I froze. My blood felt cold and stopped in my veins. It was a moose, female, fully grown, standing maybe 20 feet from me in the middle of the road. It stopped and turned to look at me. I was scared with no backup plan. What can a 12-year-old do up against a fully grown moose? Then it happened. I heard another noise. I thought I was truly dead. This time, it was behind me. I thought now my life was over. I'm between a mama and baby moose, and I am going to die. I remember feeling frozen, and not at all tranquil and at peace. I couldn't even scream. From the edge of my eyesight, I saw the second moose emerging from the thick strand of alder trees and disappear behind me. I could hear the steps on the soft dirt, my eyes locked onto the moose in front of me, trying to will it to stay calm. I stopped breathing. Then I felt it. A gentle whoosh of warm air down the back of my neck, followed by the unmistakable sound of a forced inhale. The moose behind me was sniffing my head. I could feel the breath, hear the nostrils flare. Some neighbor had dogs off in the woods away, and they must have gotten out of their yard and started barking inside the trees. That startled both moose, that turned and ran back the way they came, crashing into the small trees and leaving. To this day, the only animal I'm afraid of is moose. I've been fishing with brown bears, had black bears say hi as they walk by my camp. Mountain lions stalk us and then leave. It doesn't rattle me until I see a cow moose alone. And then I just hope to whatever is higher than me that I am not between her and her cub. This happened to me a few years ago, and I can really say it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Me and some friends were camping on a small island close to the mainland. Here in Norway during summer, it doesn't really get dark. We basically just have different shades of grey during the night. Around 5 in the morning, me and a friend were up, talking close to the water, huddled up in our sleeping bags, drinking some Jägermeister. Covering the water is a thick mist. As the sun is rising, both me and my friend could swear that the mist is moving. We're there speechless, just watching the theatre unfold. You could see moving people on the water, kind of like walking or floating. They were all moving in one direction. Some of them were going in circles. The only thing that you could really see were the outlines of the figures. It was really peaceful as they were slowly migrating from one place to another. Both of us were talking a bit, and we could both see the same people. On one hand, they were just outlines, but on the other, they all had really clear characteristics. When I think back, it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. It was a long weekend at the mountains. The weather was about 19 Celsius, and I was the only person that had camped before. I suggested everyone else not to pitch their tents on a very flat surface in case of rain. It hadn't rained in weeks, so it was pretty dry, so they paid no attention to my words. 2 or 3 a.m. came, and one of the biggest storms I had ever seen started pouring. The thunder and lightning was so constant, it faded out all the voices. Everyone got flooded and ended up moving into my 10-people tent, even though there were 16 of us in total. My girlfriend and I were the only dry ones. When the lightning stopped, we heard a huge crack, followed by a super loud scream. And then, complete silence. It was a female scream. Nobody wanted to exit the tent because it was pouring hard. The next day, only 2 out of the 5 tents were found. The water took the rest. Everybody's provisions were lost. The loud female scream was of a camping couple who were near our location, and a tree fell, crushing part of their tent. They were okay, but so traumatized they didn't speak a single word. We thought we were the only ones camping in the area, so the scream caught us totally by surprise. Super